Hi, I'm Ann, the city clerk for the city of Albany. So would all of you please rise and raise your right hand. Repeat after me. I, and please state your name.
I, Robert Crosswalk,
Do solemnly affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States,
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Thank you. Please have a seat. I'm sorry, I should have said welcome. Congratulations on your appointments and reappointments. I will go around, if you can sign the paper real quick for me, and then you can go on with your meeting.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and welcome back, and welcome to the commission, new commissioners. Good to have you here. With that, I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask our staff to take roll.
Commissioner Del Rosario.
Present.
Commissioner Javendel.
Present.
Commissioner Jordan.
Present.
Commissioner Paulson.
Present.
Chair McCroskey.
Present. So I think we have minutes from a previous meeting to approve. Are there any comments on the minutes as voluminously recorded? Oh, we'll just take a minute and read them now. No, I see that's tonight's agenda. I'm sorry. Let's not read the minutes now. Does anybody have any comments?
Move approval of the minutes.
Second.
We have a move and a second. Any discussion? I guess only three of us are voting on this. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Everybody voted for. The minutes pass. We can move right on. With public comment. And this is the moment in the meeting when we have general public comment for items that are not otherwise on the agenda. So this is a time to speak out for something that you wouldn't otherwise speak out for later in the agenda. And I have, looks like at least one comment from Brian Parsley. And it looks like we'll follow that up with Kathy Madison.
Good evening, Commissioners. Brian Parsley, Albany resident. I'm just here on behalf of my neighbors of the 900 block of Peralta. We talked tonight. As some of you know, we came here approximately a little over a year ago to discuss speed bumps, speed humps, and street treatments. We're now working towards getting those street treatments, but the issue, the larger issue that I want to address is communication. And there's been a little bit of lack of communication between the city and some of the residents, and there's some hurt feelings with that because it's been so long. I know there's been a transition within some staff, and previous staff had, I believe, told this commission that the street treatments, the bollards that we had discussed, and street markings could happen very quickly. That did not happen. And so we continued to wait and continued to wait, and then it became clear that that wasn't going to happen. At council last night, or I'm sorry, at council on Tuesday, the change order went in for some of the street projects, and we were told that the bollards and the street markings were going to be part of that change order. And I relayed that to some of my neighbors, but the other issue, of course, was the neighbors were told that this would be an agenda item for tonight's meeting, and it was when the final agenda came out, it was not. So, and that was not communicated to the neighbors. So this is like kind of a much larger issue with regards to not just this commission or not the council, but to a larger communication problem within the city at large. So there seems to be a breakdown, and whether that's, it kind of goes both ways. The public also needs to do their part, check the agendas, but the issue is when you're told that there's going to be something on the agenda and then it's not, that becomes a little bit problematic. So we're moving hopefully in the right direction, and we hope to be back in March to discuss speed humps. Thank you.
Thank you. Come on up.
I'm here for kind of a similar thing. I live on Cornell Avenue, and I know there's a long history of people in that neighborhood trying to get some traffic calming, potentially close some streets there. And I know it goes back to 2015 that the Traffic and Safety Commission directed the council to include specific traffic calming measures in the budget. And I haven't been able to keep track of where everything is, and I'm just wondering what we need to do to kind of move forward with implementing some of the traffic calming suggestions, recommendations, and plans that were proposed by people that the city paid to do studies and, you know, say we need traffic circles, we need stop signs, we need speed bumps. We did get speed bumps, but they virtually don't do anything. The cars just fly over them. So we're still plagued with all of this cut-through traffic to the plaza, and it hasn't abated, as far as I know, unless there have been additional traffic studies on Cornell. But Cornell is just a disaster in terms of traffic and speed and aggressive driving, and just, you know, quality of life is really impacted by the kind of traffic we have on that street. And so I'm just kind of like, it's 2019, and I'm hoping that this year maybe we can see some progress. And I'm just wondering what, as residents, we need to do to kind of shepherd this through, because apparently without, you know, citizen input and urging, it's not going to happen. Because I mean, we've had meeting after meeting after meeting, and input suggestions, this and that, and nothing has happened there yet, except for the speed humps. There's no curb painting, nothing was done on Brighton, traffic circles weren't put in, and, you know, it's not going to just get better, as far as I can see. So what I'd like from this commission is just to kind of know, have I missed something? Was it taken out of the capital budget? And, you know, what we can do to move forward, because the problem hasn't just gone away. It still exists. And it's, so that's kind of what I want to know, and where we're at, where we're going to be, and how can we, as people who live in the area, help and assist, and how can we maybe dovetail this into other initiatives the city is, you know, working on, like green and things like that.
Ma'am, you've run over time a little bit. Before you go, have you attempted to contact city staff?
I haven't, but I can, so that's a good start.
I'd like to point you in that direction first.
Okay.
And we'd certainly be willing to take it up in the future, but I think you could get a lot of clear information. And
I will be happy to meet with both neighborhoods at your convenience. We can talk through it.
Well, I'm just acting on my own behalf right now because I feel like, I guess what I need to do is talk to you and see what the heck is going on. Okay.
And then you can feel free to contact the chair of the commission, whoever comes out of tonight, and ask that it be put on a future agenda between meetings. Great. Thank you for the public comment. And I'd like to move us along to our presentations, and we'll start off with the monthly police data on collisions and citations.
Thank you. Reporting on data from the police department in December, there was 1 pedestrian collision, 0 bicycle collisions, 14 vehicle collisions, 7 of which were categorized as injury collisions. There were 45 moving citations issued by the police department in the month of December and 3 DUI arrests.
Any questions from the commission?
Since there's only one pedestrian collision, do you know the nature of that one?
I don't. I can request that information.
Okay, just email would be fine. Thanks.
You probably have already discussed this, but is there any sense that the trend in pedestrian collisions is a data issue or if it's real? In other words, if you go back a couple of years, was that potentially due to underreporting, or is it thought that that's probably likely what's going on in reality?
In terms of the trend line?
Well, or the incidents. I mean, you had, looks like 7 months in 2016 with no collisions in a row. So overall, the trend is up, whether you look at the trend line or just the raw data.
This is the raw data. I don't know the
Data
ins
collection.
and outs from
Yeah.
2016.
Okay.
Any other questions from the commission? Are there any public questions or comments on the data? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the commission. Are there any comments, requests? I think we've all gotten pretty used to looking at the data in this format. It's interesting to see the trend lines change a little bit over time. It doesn't seem to be dramatic. It's interesting, pedestrian collisions seem to be going up, cycling collisions slightly trending down, maintaining. Something would be good to keep an eye on. But any other comments before we close this?
Well, I'm happy that it's a small sample size, which means any little fluctuations may look substantial. With only a few years' worth of data, it's hard to draw any big conclusions. Looking at sort of national crash rates, there have been patterns that aren't necessarily city collisions, but freeway and city streets, where injury or fatality numbers have gone up. They had been dropping for 30-plus years or more. But again, relative to this, I don't see sort of a significance that we can draw. Nighttime collisions are apparently up nationally over the last 6 years. I want to say like 46% increase in nighttime crashes, only 15% increase in daytime crashes, which is an interesting pattern. And number of questions and speculations as to causes for that between street lighting and the lighting in cars all changing, and some may be good, some may be bad.
Fashion trends towards black garments.
Distraction, lighting. There's so many factors that can all sort of play in different directions that it's hard to pinpoint any one thing. But it's, you know, if we were to drill down into time of day and things like that, again, with such a small sample size, we wouldn't find anything statistically significant. But I do appreciate the format that we get this presented to us. It has been much more useful than just hearing one set of numbers at a time and not having anything to compare against.
I mean, the reason I asked about the pedestrian data is because my guess is that if you ran that through a statistical trend test, there would actually be a significant trend there
Yeah.
on this one at this point. So that's why I was asking is, you know, what's the quality of the data?
It's a little hard to know. I mean, it's reported collisions.
Yeah.
Pedestrians are more likely to report if they've been hit by a car, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know.
Thanks.
Any other comments before we move on? Great. Thank you. Let's move on to the shared mobility data.
So gig car share reported an increase in the month of December following a couple months of decline in October and November, both in their membership and in the number of trips. So that bounced back a little bit, still not at the peaks that they saw a few months before, but improvement in the trend.
Do you know if they're increasing their fleet or advertising or?
They report on the number of vehicles in service across the entire service area, which includes Berkeley, Oakland, Alameda, I believe. I did not hear back from them when I was asking earlier, and my initial read was it with changeover at UC Village that, you know, people that left that sort of kept their membership maybe for a month or two and then finally got around to canceling it, that kind of thing. So I don't know if there are specific factors here or if this trend was represented also in other parts of the service area. I haven't heard back on that. But.
Is that what you've got to show or?
I have the information from Lime Bike Share. They continue to have declining number of bikes available and similar declines in the number of trips. Electric scooters continue to have a trickle of one scooter here or there, makes it into the area and has some riders. So sharing that information because we're going to be talking about that a little later as well in the agenda.
Robert, you went first last time. Did you want to go first, Preston?
Sure. So is there data on here about how many bicycles they had available on average in the city? Am I missing that or somewhere on this? Or
There is, I did not show that this time around. Actually on the manual bike, what is shown in the bar chart is the number of vehicles.
oh, I see. That's
that
not.
is, so yeah. and
That's
it's-
not number of trips. That's number of vehicles.
That's number of vehicles, and that's what, was down to almost zero for a little bit, has bounced around like a dozen bikes or so the last couple weeks reported.
Thanks. And I noticed looking at the map In the application, they have a line drawn around El Cerrito and Richmond now, almost like Albany's not included in their territory anymore. I don't know. I don't know what it means.
That just looks like a city boundary. It doesn't look like a,
But they don't have one between Albany and Berkeley.
Berkeley, okay.
So I don't know what's going on. And at some scales, when you look at it, that area is actually tinted green and Albany's not. Used to be that Berkeley was tinted red and everything else was not.
Yeah, right.
Now it's kind of seemed to have reversed.
Are there bikes?
So there are right now, they've got a bunch of bikes at, looks like Washington and Solano, a whole stack of them, and that's about it for Albany. Yeah.
did you say Washington and
I'm sorry, Washington, Washington and San Pablo, thank you. So if we do have any, or if you happen to have any interaction with them, it might be interesting to ask them why that line, what does that line mean? And thanks.
Other questions?
I think my question was answered, or it's similar at least. So this shows the number of bikes, so therefore this is not use, this is supply of bikes? Or, so they're dropping their supply of bikes in Albany according to demand?
I believe their fleet is declining, so they are not replacing or purchasing new bikes at this point.
They have to be yanking bikes out, right? I mean, there was a whole bunch of bikes, whatever, 6 months ago during the pilot program.
Or when they need maintenance, or, yeah, I don't.
They're not.
I don't,
But they're reducing the supply.
yes.
Okay.
Kind of following up on that, do we have a sense of whether the bikes that we're seeing are ones that they deploy or that people happen to ride here and leave?
So I think they are still actively deploying some.
Okay.
They're not increasing, they've said they're not increasing their supply, they're continuing to maintain some amount. They don't get actively deployed to the same extent that scooters do, there is more. But I think, I have seen them where you see several in
Lined up,
one
yeah.
spot, which
Okay.
I think is an indication of a deployment rather than a bunch of people converging in one location.
Synchronized.
Yeah, people who show up in the same spot don't tend to align their bikes. It's too bad. Other questions? Is there any public comment on this data? Seeing none, bring it back to the commission. Any comments? Great. Thank you for showing us the data. We're going to move right on to our item number 5, discussion and possible action of matters. And we're going to start with item number 5.1, the Albany Pavement Management Program and Capital Improvement Project Planning. Say that 6 times fast. I believe this is going to be maybe a part 1 of 2.
Yes, that's correct. As your agenda suggests, well, this is the first of 2 parts. We'll come back in February for the second part. The presentation is on the city's pavement management system, so tonight we'll be talking substantially about StreetSaver, what data StreetSaver needs, how is it used to develop condition assessments, as well as the city's use as an assessment asset management tool. February's meeting will go into a discussion of funding levels and how those different levels will impact street network condition over time. What other types of factors that staff looks at beyond StreetSaver to select streets, to put together projects, and then put together different treatment methods for different streets. So all of that will be in February. So just in terms of managing this part, Jenny Van Dyke and Ryan Schaefer are both here from NCE, so I'll introduce them. In terms of questions, if you have questions specifically about StreetSaver and how it works, functionality, those can be directed to NCE. In terms of policy, certainly you can direct those to staff, that we can probably hopefully answer some of those. So in terms of NCE's expertise, let me just say a couple words, and then I'll hand it over to Ryan. But NCE is a pavement and transportation experts here in the Bay Area. They've been doing this for a long time. They've got substantial experience in pavement distress evaluations across the Bay Area. Cities and counties, numerous cities and counties have used them for deploying and developing pavement management systems like we're doing, pavement management programs. And they have essentially an asset management approach to doing that. So it favors the way public works staff likes to attack this problem. And they also provide project-level expertise as well. So we've used them specifically for projects on Evelyn Avenue on the design side. One of the things that we like about them is that they really pay attention to local priorities. So as we're deploying Street Saver, as we're using that as a tool, there's an active conversation about what the local priorities are for our community. So part of that discussion will be tonight, and that will also carry over into February's meeting, where we're going to be looking to the commission to give us some of that feedback. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Robert. Talk directly into the mic here, because I remember I got reminded several times to talk into the mic. Just to kind of start off, I'm sure many of you know this, but Street Saver is widely used throughout the Bay Area. It's a good planning tool. It's a good accounting tool for keeping track of where your streets are, the preliminary treatments that you should be selecting, and how to just to kind of figure out how you're going to attack this large asset. It's the number one asset of most cities and counties. So the first confusing part of that is just figuring out what you have, what the conditions are, and how you should prioritize your budgets. So that's really what Street Saver does. Beyond Street Saver, which we'll talk about, is a lot of policy decisions. Do you want to focus on arterials or bikeways? Or whatever your focus might be, the worst first. Street Saver takes and establishes an overall prioritization based on a weighting factor, functional classification, the condition of the pavement, and comes up with the most cost-effective way for you to select pavement treatments. But it's going to be blind to things like bikeways and AC transit and policy decisions that the city might have. So just keep that in mind. Street Saver is just a planning tool, takes you to a step, and then beyond that, you have to have policy decisions that guide you beyond that. So just a reminder, all 9 Bay Area counties use this, 100% usage. All 109 agencies use it. It's 43,000 lane miles managed in the Bay Area by this program. That doesn't include Southern California. We do the statewide needs assessment for the entire state. And so there's, I think statewide, there's about 50% usage of Street Saver. There's other programs out there that people utilize, but the Bay Area has 100% usage. And MTC allocates about $1.5 million to help agencies. It's kind of the carrot and the stick. The carrot is they give $1.5 million to help all these agencies update their pavement management. And the stick is if you don't use the program and keep your assets managed well and keep them apprised of the conditions, then you're at risk for STIP. The vast majority of the agencies that we use this program, they're very positive response to using the program. So we're going to cover all the way through the pink. We're going to talk about some goals and objectives, the database, what Street Saver kind of keeps track of and accounts for you. It's the accounting system. The condition assessment, which every 2 years for your arterials and collectors, every 4 to 5 years for your residentials. You're updating the conditions and putting that back in the system, updating your unit costs, because we know that contractors are in short supply, and we have to keep up to speed on unit costs and things that are changing in contracting. And then it goes back into really figuring out planning. Okay, I've got the condition of my streets. This is what it costs to maintain them. This is the decision tree that helps me figure out how to maintain those. Now I'm going to figure out, what do I need to do with a given budget? If I only have $1 million or $500,000, how should I best effectively deploy that money? And that's really where Street Saver takes you through. The rest beyond that, it kind of be, I think, part 2 of our presentation is really more governed by policy decisions, and then when you get into specifics of going out and looking at the streets, deciding the best treatments, and developing your plans, your specs, and engineer's estimate for these plans. So just real quickly, I've already talked too much, I think, Jenny really has the vast majority of this presentation. She'll do a great job. It's just we really want to document the street assets, where they are, their condition, establish, usage based on functional classifications. We'll talk maybe about community priorities. I think that's, again, back to some policy decisions. There's obviously funding constraints, with exception to a few cities in the Bay Area and in the South Bay. Most people are underfunded, so you're dealing with trade-offs. You have to, if you're going to fund this, then you're not going to fund that. So those are kind of policy decisions. And then project development. After you've done you've updated your pavement management system, the condition of your streets, you've updated your decision tree and all the unit costs. Then you got to figure out what program I might develop over the next 5 years. Some of that's governed by Street Saver, some of it's governed by policy decision. And then monitoring your performance. How are we doing? So we said we were going to be at this network PCI in 5 years. We spent the amount of money that we're supposed to spend, but yet our PCI is still declining. So what's going on, and trying to figure out how we're doing in terms of performance. So why do we need pavement management? It's because it's all throughout your community. There's a lot of it, and it's hard to track. So you need a pavement management system that brings all that together and creates an accounting system so that you can figure out how to best manage your pavements, which are very important to the community, and everyone gets on them when they go out their front door, and it's very important to people when they leave their homes, the condition of the pavement in front of their house and the bikes they travel on and the cars they get to work in. So that's why we need to manage it. Basic things of what it does. It just tells you what you own and maintain, what you're responsible for, what the condition of the pavement is in, what repairs are needed to be made. Is it a slurry seal? Is it crack sealing? Is it reconstruction, overlays? What from a planning aspect, what do you need to start thinking about in terms of treatments? And how many dollars is it? You asked Street Saver, what will it take to get to a PCI of 75? Which is a really good condition, or what would it take just to maintain the current condition of our streets? You can ask all those questions with a good pavement management system over 5, 10 years, whatever period of time you want to look at. And as I mentioned, the impacts of different funding levels. If I only have $500,000, well, how's my pavement going to perform at the network level given that? If I have $1 million or $2 million, what's the performance going to be? So that's really, I think, what typical questions that the pavement management system answers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ryan. Good evening. So I wanted the next series of slides are to help provide some more information to your group on how Street Saver works, kind of an overview, and then also give you an explanation as to how the city's database is currently set up. One of the first items that goes into developing the database is part of the inventory, and that is the inventory of all of your city maintained roads. Each street in the city's network is classified by function. So we have 3 general functional classifications in the city's database that the city uses, and those are arterials, collectors, and residentials. Those residentials are your local roads, relatively low volume usage. Collectors are the streets that kind of funnel your residential roads to the arterials, essentially. And then the arterials are your commercial and business district or school areas that sees higher volumes of different types of traffic. The way that this table, the city's functional classifications are broken down is the way they're assigned is based on a couple of things. Both the California road system map, which is adopted by the Federal Highway Administration and Caltrans, and then also using city priorities. So making sure that the city agrees with those classifications, and then the city has every opportunity to change any sort of classifications as they see fit. And the city has decided to take, as you can see, I'm going to highlight a couple things here. In the green, those are subsets of the collector functional classification. So About half of the collector streets on this list, or in the city's database, are actually local roads identified by the Federal Highway Administration, but because they serve as bike routes identified by the city's active transportation program, there's the city wants to prioritize those routes more than they would have if they were just still remained as residential streets. So as you can see now, usually in a community like Albany, you'd have residentials be your bulk of your network. However, by making this transition, the number of collector streets in the city surpasses the number of residential streets. This is a map of the city's network, and this is the color coding is by functional classification. So you see your red streets are your arterials. So you've got Solano, Marin, part of Buchanan, and Key Route are the main arterials in the city. San Pablo Avenue, of course, is maintained by Caltrans. And then you can see how much blue there is, which is the collector system. So that includes a lot of both local roads that also serve bicyclists through bike routes. This is an example from the city's active transportation plan that outlines a lot of the city's bike route network. These are two examples of what the Federal Highway Administration classified as local roads based on their typical volume. But because they are on the city's bike route system, the city is elected to upgrade them to a collector classification. And that would be Adams Avenue, just west of San Pablo, and then Keynes Avenue, just to the right, or the east of San Pablo Avenue. So the next kind of topic, so that kind of goes over some of the database, the inventorying. The other part of the inventorying that goes into developing your database is condition assessment. So one of the programs that Ryan mentioned just a bit ago is something funded through MTC, which is their Pavement Technical Assistance Program, PTAP. It's a regional program that helps local agencies maintain their pavement management program by supporting them financially to offer them grants to help support that effort. So, and then the funding is meant to go towards typically inspecting the streets to update those conditions on a regular basis, and then perform continually updated funding analysis scenarios that are used for local and for regional transportation planning efforts. So this is an illustration or some photographs of some typical distresses that are usually surveyed. Everything from alligator cracking, there's different severities of each kind of distress that are surveyed. And these surveys are based on a calibrated and standardized specification on both type of distress and severity. So there's basically a booklet there that tells you how do you rate the condition of a road. And so all the inspectors, especially those that work through MTC and their PTAP program, are certified through MTC. They go through a training and are certified based on how they perform on their rating abilities. So that way MTC can keep track of how calibrated all of the consultants are that perform this work. This goes into the PCI categories that are used as part of the rating system, or that the distress surveys eventually develop. So through a series of algorithms from the distress survey that's completed, you can develop a PCI, or Pavement Condition Index, PCI, and that varies anywhere from 0 to 100, 0 being a street that's in failed condition that needs a lot of help, 100 being a street that's essentially brand new. And within that 0 to 100 range, you see there's a breakdown of different categories that are given a name just to give you a sense of verbal, or how you would put a word to that condition between 0 and 100. So you have the very good and good conditions up in the 70 to 100 point range. You have some streets that may be in fair or at risk of falling into the poor condition, and then you have those that are pretty much failed.
Before you go on,
Yes.
how does Albany at 53 rating, how does that relate to other cities in the area? Or compare, I should say.
Well, I think, do you happen to remember some of those statistics? I know that it's
I know your neighbor.
kind of in the middle.
Fareed and I know their neighboring community. I think you're sitting around a 57, 56. So pretty comparable. A lot of communities in the East Bay in that at-risk category, 50 to 70. South Bay, don't look at them too much. But the Peninsula, East Bay, North Bay, most of the agencies are in that, I'd say in the 50 to 60s. So you're in good company.
Great, thank you. Sorry I jumped the gun a little there.
It's all right. I figured that question might come up. You used to have a slide for it. So this next slide is a general one of my percentages is missing. This slide gives you an idea of the distribution throughout the network of those streets that are in the good, pretty healthy condition range, and that's about half of the city's network at this time.
It says 52% on the hard copy.
Oh, thank you. Just over a half. The other half is either at risk or at dropping into a poor condition, or as you can see, almost a quarter of the network is currently estimated to be in poor condition, and then less than that to be in very poor, almost failed. This is just an overview map of the city's network, giving you an idea of the distribution of the conditions throughout the city. Again, there's you can always pick up easily on the red hot spots where the worst, and then you've got almost kind of a complete rainbow here throughout the entire city, so it's really kind of spread out, which is why it's kind of in the middle. It's at a 53, so you've got a wide distribution of each kind of category. The next part that StreetSaver can help out with is your planning, which in this case is your treatment toolbox, and using both different treatments that are industry standard basically, and either those used for a long time, or even those that can be more of a value engineering or have some different advantages. You have your preventative maintenance category. Those would be your types of seals that you put on streets that are usually in the good or maybe the fair condition. You've got rehabilitation options that include overlays and using rubberized products in your overlay, or cold in place recycling, which is also a value engineering type option. And then with your reconstruction, you've got some conventional methods, replacing the entire section with a brand new virgin section of pavement and base material, and then another recycling option, which is fold up reclamation. So that's just kind of skimming the top of different options that are available to the city that are considered at the planning level. And then, of course, when it gets, as Ryan mentioned, further down the road, when it gets to developing those, gets to be time to developing your plans and an estimate for construction, that's when you can get into more design to figure out what's the best treatment for each street. This is an important curve that is descriptive of how important it is to maintain your streets in good condition. So what this curve shows us is over the first 40% of typically of a new pavement section's life, it remains in the good condition category. So it's eligible for a surface seal, which is a very cost-effective way of, it's preventative maintenance, basically. So it's ideal to use that cost-effective treatment at the right time, early on, and keep doing so as it's applicable. And then as the curve, you can see, starts to trend downwards, and then it takes a much steeper dive at the very end. That's where you start to really drop off. So you can see the yellow category is right at the cusp of, which is the at-risk. That's right at the cusp of when your pavements start to, you're kind of teetering between an overlay and then getting into much, much thicker and more expensive treatments. So this is an example of why it's important to maintain your roads and at the optimum time, which is when they're still in good or fair condition, when it's much more affordable to maintain them. Oh, and I should say that this is something that StreetSaver looks into when it's creating that list of effective treatments and what's most cost-effective when putting together the scenario results in your budget scenarios, which we'll get into, I think, more so next time. So this slide gives you an idea of those treatments that we just talked about, and by condition category, which are the color codes, and then the PCI ranges, which I've shown you in a slide before. And then you have the 3 different functional classifications: arterials and collectors, and then residentials. The arterials and collectors are lumped together on the left just because they have a much more similar, in the city's current decision tree, they have a very similar structure in what treatments are used in this planning phase. And then on the residential side, you have more of the cost-effective treatments, which is by way of a cape seal, which is a much heavier duty surface seal, as opposed to a more, I should go back to the slide, as opposed to the more expensive overlay treatment. So if you were to look at the thin overlay, I should have gone over these numbers, I apologize. The dollar sign in the surface seal box is meant to indicate that it's some dollar value. And then if you were to compare it to the expense of a thin or a thick overlay, you're talking about 12, 19, 20 times the cost, basically. And then reconstruction starts to greatly surpass that at anywhere between 30 or more times the cost of a surface seal, just to give you an idea of the importance and the value of maintaining your network in good condition.
While we're here, if you do a surface seal, do you have to remove things like thermoplastic markings on the roadway first and then reapply those?
Correct. Yes. So
If you're doing a major reconstruction, you just destruct it with everything else.
exactly.
Is that a big expense removal?
No.
Okay.
That's very small in comparison to the larger labor and material items.
Okay.
So yes.
Thanks.
Ken, a question too? Back on that other graph. So what's the average length of time, say, to get to very poor pavement conditions? So I'm wondering, we obviously have streets that get to very poor pavement condition, and either we purposely or not purposely made a decision to not do any treatments up to that point. And I'm wondering if the amount of time that it takes to get to a very poor condition is worth the cost, because you don't have to do surface seal or any of the other improvements. You can, wait and delay. I think the answer is no.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, that has to do with the life cycle cost analysis of,
Right.
of what types of treatments would you give a road that was built, to a typical or standardized design section, for instance, and that would be your starting point. And then if you just let it go and see what happens, of course you would see it fail much more soon than you would if you had applied a series of preventative maintenance treatments or even rehabilitation like an overlay. So that in itself, you're not letting yourself drop all the way down to the failed condition quite as soon, really prolonging the life of your original investment.
I think that experiment is being conducted in many places.
Yes.
Just one question, maybe you can clarify those different treatments. How close do those get you back to 100 PCI?
Oh, sure. Well, I could just use these as an example, or I could even go back further. which, because this just goes through a couple of the seal options. So I'll just start with the easy ones. If you were to put down an overlay, for instance, or reconstruct your road, your PCI would, according to StreetSaver, would be 100 because you've got a brand new pavement surface, especially if it was constructed the way it was designed, you know, brand new asphalt surface. So if somebody were to go out there and rate that street, they would find no distresses to dock points off of the PCI of 100, for instance. And over time, you'll see a little bit of a drop, which you can kind of see in this curve. It does start to drop off, and that's usually because of environmental effects, because your pavement is oxidizing, for instance, and it's exposed to weathering and stuff. When you look at the slurry seal and rubber cape seal type options, the PCI won't necessarily go to 100 unless the pavement below was in super shape already, and the slurry seal is just there to make sure you're covering all the cracks and fixing all the alligator cracking. So certainly doing the right kind of prep maintenance ahead of your seal to address things like that, cracks and fatigue cracking. Those will certainly further the advantage of putting down those preventive maintenance treatments. So it kind of depends on where your PCI was to begin with and how well you prepared that surface before putting down those preventive maintenance type treatments. But typically they won't get you to 100, but they're meant to get you pretty close depending on where you started.
Thanks.
Okay, so back to this slide. So this kind of gives you an idea of how the city's decision tree is set up currently with the very good condition where you've got a road that's between 90 and 100. You probably just paved it in the last few years. It's not quite ready for some preventative maintenance. So by the time it drops just below 90 is probably an appropriate time to begin that series of treatments. And which is where the good condition category steps in, and where you're between a 70 or an 89. That's generally where StreetSaver recommends, or the way that the city's decision tree is set up to recommend when the city should put down a slurry seal when that street is eligible. The next couple of categories, there is a difference between the two functional classification sets. So there are arterials and collectors, which take different types of traffic, heavier loads of traffic, of course, servicing bike routes as well. There tends to be a preference, and also from a construction standpoint, to give those more of a robust rehabilitation treatment. Whereas on the right side, you have residential streets where cape seals, while I was mentioning if you do the right kind of preparation work to the surface and treat those major failures before you put on a seal, the cape seal is just more, it's thicker than a slurry seal. So you can also introduce a rubberized product to that, to a cape seal as well, which makes it more, the cracking from down underneath the seal what's the word I'm looking for? It retards.
Less likely to propagate?
Yes, slower too. It's slower too. So it's a more cost-effective treatment, and it's works very well on local roads and can have a very long lifespan. And when I say very long, at least 10 years, as long as it's prepared properly and applied properly. And then again, for your thin and thick overlays, same thing goes for those. You also have to include some preparation work where you've addressed major failures in the road or milled off a very heavily cracked surface, for instance. And then, of course, when you get to the very poor condition, it's difficult to salvage that with anything other than reconstructing your pavement. And then down below the bottom row where it says waiting, so we wanted to show these three numbers, which give you an indication of how StreetSaver looks at each functional classification when it's rating what's most cost-effective for your network, and how, based on kind of the priority of usage, really. So because arterials tend to be used by more people than your local roads, has a weighting rating of 1 in relation to collectors, which have a weighting rating of 0.72, and residentials of a 0.55. So your residential streets are roughly half as likely to be selected for for treatment compared to your arterials in this case. And so that gives you also a sense of by what we're kind of saying is upgrading your residential roads that are also servicing your bike routes. They're that much more likely to be selected initially in this planning phase with Street Saver in your budget scenarios. So these are a few photos, just giving you an idea of different PCI conditions and appropriate treatments. So this is a PCI that's in good condition, it's a 75, and this is a great candidate for a surface seal, probably a slurry seal. The street's reaching 54 at this point, and you can see it's got some traffic on it, or it's maybe in a commercial district, for instance, and so a thick overlay would be, or not necessarily thick, but an overlay on this street would be most appropriate. And this one looks like a local road, quite a bit of surface cracking, same sort of treatment could be used on this street in category 43. An overlay would be appropriate for this, or depending on the city's decision-making, you can stretch your dollars and even apply a rubberized Cape Seal, for instance, on a street like this while addressing some of the worst areas and with appropriate, as we call dig-outs, where you're ripping out all the failed pavement and applying some crack sealant to those cracks on the surface. It'll prolong the life of your seal that you just apply. And this one needs some help. This is a street that's got a PCI less than 20, and so this is where reconstruction is really your only option. Excuse me. So one of the last things I'll touch on this evening as a part of the planning part of the discussion is getting into the funding scenarios, which we'll get into more next time around, and how both the Street Saver funding scenarios, which you see on the bottom blue box there, that is just one of the sources of decision-making and data that the city uses to develop their list of candidate streets. So the city has a sewer rehab program that they have to take into account for making sure that those are programmed in, which they can be pre-programmed into Street Saver, letting you know when those sewer rehab projects will be occurring. And so you can time your, when you want to say that they're eligible then to be paved, so you're not cutting up your road because of a sewer project. And other utility work from other known projects, like from private utilities, other local priorities that might come up, and then your resource allocation, so having to do with your funding, basically. And then that helps you through the help of Street Saver and those other resources, comes up with your list of candidate streets. And this is all to get you to your paving CIP, your multi-year paving CIP. And so the next step after coming up with the list of candidate streets that you want to focus on is coming up with your treatment cycles. And that has to do with grouping those streets, because they'll be all over the map as far as geographically and type of treatment. So at that point, that's where you can then group them appropriately based on their treatment and where they're located to help you come up with a multi-year paving CIP. So just to summarize, as Ryan mentioned, we've been talking about Street Saver as a pavement management planning tool. And it's a way to help maintain your database of streets and condition surveys. The city's streets currently are assessed at being at risk with a PCI of 53. The city has upgraded over 6.5 miles of local streets to be classified as collector streets to give them more prioritization during this planning phase. We also went over the toolbox of maintenance methods and the importance of prioritizing your preventative maintenance to protect your investment. So as Robert mentioned, for next time, we'll go more into how you can implement these planning phases and the condition assessment and the information in your database and developing funding scenarios and ultimately your paving CIP, and then how you monitor how everything is working. Let's see. So I think then for next time, since we have an opportunity to get some input from the commission on this, is some things that we'd like to kind of open up for your input, which is for the budget scenarios that we can run for next time's presentation. If there are certain items that really you would like to kind of see focused on in these budget scenarios, is it something you'd like to see the overall PCI driven up, or do you want to focus on a certain functional classification, or improving specifically your bike routes, or a certain area of roads, certain neighborhood or something. And then there's, of course, all those streets that are in poor condition, or very poor condition, I should say, that are definitely streets that people may complain about the most because they're in such bad condition, and is that something that you want to focus on as well? And then if you want to consider using more of the cost-effective Cape seals versus overlays on your bike route. So those are all items that we wanted to bring up for discussion. And that's all we have for tonight. So we'll open up for questions now.
All right. So commissioners, questions, additional questions on the presentation?
First, thanks so much for taking us through that, and thanks to staff for arranging this. I'm not sure what motivated this, but it's great to have this at the first meeting where I'm a commissioner. I was wondering if you could go to slide 8, please. I have some questions there.
Preston, while they're toggling back, the staff's intention is for this to be an annual presentation. So as we continue on, this part will probably be condensed as we're learning as we go, and then the second part of this presentation will coincide with how did we do last summer, what do we think we did well, did we get good value out of the money we spent in the last package, and then how does that look going forward in the next CIP. So I don't know if we've done that in the past, but Public Works staff is trying to do that for sewer rehabilitation and streets once a year.
That's great. I think the new Public Works staff, in my engagement and what I've seen, is doing a lot better in terms of communication and tracking, and so I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Are we on the right slide, by the way?
It was actually the one that had the map with the streets by functional classification.
Okay.
Yeah. So on that one, so this doesn't match the general plan for Albany. Is this what is this based on? Is this based on the general plan plus upgrading the bike routes to collectors, or what is this exactly?
So the general plan is based on the state designation. This is information that we can choose to change from there. So this is staff applying the interest of taking some of those streets and changing it from a local street into a collector when we know that there's interest doing that because it's a bike route. If it's on the ATP plan, then we're moving it into a different category. And that's really, the purpose there is to look at a budgeting tool so we can make sure that we understand if it's going to get a different treatment, we can start predicting what that's going to cost us on a 5- and 10-year basis.
And so, for instance, Cornell has been upgraded to a collector, but it's not a bike route in the ATP. So do you know why that is on this map?
Right, we can look at that. I think Cornell was one of those where it was identified in the state allocation as a collector.
Oh, wow.
We didn't necessarily agree with that, but we weren't going to downgrade it without really kind of thinking that through.
Okay, so yeah, I guess I won't dwell on this anymore, but it would be helpful for me to sort of have a better understanding of, there's sort of 3 different classification sets going on, and they're kind of all getting merged together in a way. And so it'd be helpful for me to know sort of which classification is coming from which of those sets and which set is driving the classification on each street.
I think one easy way to do that would be, our efforts were based on looking at a figure from the city's recent ATP reporting, I think, that was conducted a few years ago. And so any collector that's not listed on that map or any street that's not listed on that map as a bike route that you see on this map, that would be coming from the California Road System map. In fact, that map, the California Road System map, I might have said that backwards.
Yeah.
The California Road System map is also available online.
Oh, okay.
If you just go to the Caltrans website, they have all those listed and throughout the whole state.
Wow, I had no idea the state reached down that far into the system. It's kind of alarming.
It's so they can put housing on all those roads.
Yeah. Should I keep going, or?
Please.
Your pleasure. Okay. I was curious, you mentioned $1.5 million per year is set aside or designated by MTC for the PTAP. Well, actually, I presume that was per year, so that's question number 1. Is that per year? And so different jurisdictions are getting those grants each year because they only are doing a major redo of their plan every 5 years and redoing part of it every 2 years, or how does the cyclicity work on that?
Agency is eligible every 2 years because of the frequency of your inspection, I guess.
Requirement, frequency,
Yeah, the frequency, exactly. So, the agency, for instance, the City of Albany, which I forgot to mention, I apologize. The City of Albany has applied for this recent round and has been awarded and will be conducting their own with a consultant appointed by MTC to be doing a full network inspection and budget option report, which will be starting this summer, and then a report should be available by next January or so.
Okay. And last time I engaged with this, which was in 2013, the grant to Albany was $15,000. I don't know if that's like a monetary grant or a grant of services in kind. I don't know how MTC arranges that program.
Those grants are based on, I think it's based on the size of your network. They have like a dollars per mile or so that they offer, and then the city has to match that as well. And then if they elect to, and that's based on the pricing, the typical pricing, I think, of conducting these budget option reports and inspections, walking inspections. And so that's how that number is generated.
And so does anybody know if it's a monetary grant or a grant of services from a pre-vetted stable of consultants?
I believe that's a reimbursable expense, so the city would contract with a consultant and then turn around and get reimbursed for half of that, or whatever fraction.
Do you know how much money is, well, there's different buckets. How much money is, I guess, in the surface transportation, I don't remember what the P stands for, but for pavement maintenance per year, and how much money overall, including local funds, all sources of funds are spent on pavement maintenance within the Bay Area jurisdictions, those 109 Bay Area jurisdictions?
Yeah, so typically, the PTAP, the purpose of the PTAP grant is really to offset most of the costs. So these agencies are updating every 2 to 3 years. You can apply for the PTAP every year. You may not get it every year, depending on how many applicants. So every 2 to 3 years, most agencies are getting these PTAP grants. And the idea is that every 2 to 3 years, you're updating the conditions of your arterials, every 4 or 5 years for your residential streets. So most of the costs are being offset by this PTAP program. And for like the city of Berkeley, they've got a PTAP grant for $100,000. Their expenses to update their entire pavement management system was probably like $110,000, $120,000. So most of the costs In some agencies, it's 100%. Sometimes you have surplus money, and there's actually, you can do more, like we'll go and train staff, we'll go spend time with them training some of their inspectors to look at the streets. We'll do other tasks other than just maintaining the pavement management system because there's actually surplus funds. So it's actually a pretty generous pool of money that meets most of agencies' needs, and that's the idea, is because if agencies don't have sufficient funds to do this, they're not going to update their pavement management conditions, and then MTC is not going to have a good regional projection of what the needs are for local streets and roads.
So let me ask this a different way. What percentage is the PTAP represent of all money that is spent to maintain a pavement?
To maintain pavement or the?
All of it, yeah, the whole thing, to actually do the work.
Oh, to construction value.
Yeah.
Oh,
So is it 1%? Is it 1/10%? Is
it's
it?
probably 1 or 2%. And when you compare it to construction costs, it's a much smaller quantity. Yeah, absolutely, because construction would dwarf these planning level costs. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Robert?
Is a consideration or a classification given to truck routes and transit routes where they may have different impacts on the pavement condition?
They certainly can be. It's not directly included in or assessed in this current set of classifications. But if the city has information on that sort of, on those routes, they can certainly be included in, whether or not they want to change a classification of something that's already designated as arterial or collector, for instance.
I just wanted to clarify one other thing. So one of the other costs that goes into compared to construction costs. So let's say this is 1% for planning level costs. The next step up from that is the design. So a typical designer to develop plans, specs, and engineer's estimate, where you go out and do a detailed assessment of those, of the pavement conditions and figure out the best treatment and develop resurfacing plans, all those details, that's another 10%. And then you probably spend another 10% on CM and management during construction. So your soft costs probably a cumulative are about 30% of your construction value. So you spend about 30% designing it, managing it, making sure the contractor does it right, and then the other 70% are probably related to construction costs.
Thank you.
For the PCI, does that just look at the existing physical conditions, or does it look at how the road is used or any other assignments to the roadway?
That PCI is based just on the surface area. So it's just an area weighted rating. When you look at both individual streets, because you take a 10% sample typically of your road, and that's meant you're supposed to pick a representative area of your road, and that's supposed to be distributed and assigned to the entire street section. So so you have the opportunity, as you can tell, maybe in one of our PCI maps, that it's, there's not one section for the entire street. So because the condition can vary block to block even, the city has the opportunity of breaking that down where appropriate, so that you have a PCI that really represents that entire section. So yes, it's just area, based on area. And even when you come up with the network PCI, which is 53, as we mentioned, that's basically you're multiplying the PCI and the surface area together, and it's a weighted calculation.
Other questions?
You mentioned that if the PCI is brought to 100 either through overlay or full depth reconstruction, I'm guessing, but this is the question, is Street Saver blind to whether one or the other was done? Because if it's overlay, then presumably degradation would occur more quickly because you've got some potential damage in the base layer.
Well, I'm trying to remember if the curves.
So you're asking if the history of the construction repair type is carried forward?
Right, so you won't see it in the PCI Because they're both 100, but it actually does have a physical impact on the life of the pavement.
And that's where there are a series of distribution curves that are used, and they're usually based on functional classification. I think that's the series of curves that are used to kind of, based on historical data and future data, they can adjust the deterioration curve that we showed earlier. However, that's where the importance of updating your database on a regular basis helps in conducting those inspections, those visual inspections, to see how is this overlay performing compared to the street that we reconstructed. So over time, as you rate the condition of the road visually, you will be able to see if there are some premature failures that you have on an overlay versus some reconstructed street. You'll see those in your visual inspections. And so that will be built into and adjust your deterioration curve that StreetSaver will help make those projections on how the condition will change over time.
So is StreetSaver building a curve per block based on whatever data is in the database?
Right.
Oh.
It makes adjustments to that curve based on your historical data.
Cool. Didn't know that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Are there any questions from the public for public comment? Can I ask you to step down from the microphone for a moment? Thank you. And as usual in this case, we'll take any of your questions, and then the commission will take those into consideration and may ask them of the consultants.
Good evening. I'm Harry Chomsky. This was a great presentation, very educational. I'm really glad that the community is getting a chance to understand some of this technical stuff that we hear, or these terms that we hear thrown about. Now we know what they mean. Two comments. One about the upgrading of bike routes to collectors. I think this was addressed just barely at the end of the presentation, but that actually has two consequences. One is that they are considered more likely to be treated in a given year because they're considered higher priority routes. The other is that the treatment, the choice of treatment for a collector is the more expensive treatment. And that it seems to me that you might want to consider applying only the first upgrade to bike routes. So if you have a residential street that's a bike route, you might want to give it higher priority in terms of getting treated because of comfort and safety of people using it on bicycles. But it probably doesn't need the heavier duty treatment that a higher volume street would need. So I would suggest separating those two and not just considering those to be blanket collector streets, but rather residential streets with a priority upgrade. The second thing was on the map of street types. I noticed that Key Route looks like it's designated as an arterial, which seems to me like inconsistent with my perception of what the street looks like and how it's used. I would think that the southern part south of Solano would just be probably residential, and north of Solano maybe collector, similar to Santa Fe and Masonic. I'm not sure how it got designated as an arterial. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission. Fareed?
I wanted to kind of follow up on the point that Harry made. I have a slightly different take on it in the sense of how we categorize those collectors. One of the experiences we had in Berkeley in doing a rubberized cape seal on a bike boulevard was that we got a lot of comments that it was a rough surface. So while it may be durable, it's less pleasant to ride on. I wouldn't say unsafe. Some people tried to claim it was too rough to safely ride. I think that was a bit stretch. However, that to me would argue that if you take a look at your collectors, and some of them are traffic collectors and some are bike collectors, if you want to use terminology of that sort, the bike collectors would seem to work better with smoother surface treatments. So typically an overlay will give you that type of surface. certainly a slurry seal would, but then that's at a higher initial PCI. But if you're in that state where you're between fair and poor and you're deciding between an overlay and a Cape seal, I would say that if it's a traffic collector, go with the Cape seal. If it's a bike collector, go with the overlay so you get the smooth surface. Because certainly, especially with road bikes with thin tires, it can be a pretty significant difference in the ride experience. So I would support that. The thing that I don't know, and I borderline speculate, is with a sort of a coarser, rougher surface, certainly you're likely to get a little bit more noise, but it may have a bit more of a traffic calming effect. Certainly with pavers, people experience that that's more of, not quite a rumble strip effect, but a feeling like you shouldn't be going quite as fast. So that might almost be an argument for some of these streets that we view as residential streets, but they're mapped as collectors, that a Cape seal, as long as it's not causing undue noise, if it calms traffic just a little bit, could be somewhat beneficial, as well as maybe more cost-effective for us. So that was kind of a thought that I had.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? Does the noise impact the sound on the street for residents? And is that an issue?
I would expect so. I mean, if you drive on a rough surface and you're feeling a little bit of vibration, that's going to come through in the ambient noise in the area around, for the residents. Now, it shouldn't be that substantial.
Yeah.
So that might be something that's worth a little bit of investigation, a field trip, something to gauge whether we think that really matters. Because I can certainly see a resident who's noise sensitive saying,
Right.
I don't want that. But most of what we seem to hear is people coming in and saying, people are going too fast on my street. So there is sort of what's our prioritization, what's our criteria. So towards the whole question of how do we want to look at some of these cost alternatives for the approach, if we say categorically, if it's a bike street, we want the smoother treatment. If it's not a bike street, go with the more cost-effective treatment. Let's see what that comes out being. And then another thought relative to the budget scenarios.
Robert had wanted to respond for
yeah.
staff.
For the benefit of the commission, Tuesday, council approved the 2018 street maintenance project, which is primarily slurry seals. One section of Canes will be a Cape seal, so you'll have some experience there. Between Solano and Marin, that section I believe is designated as a Cape seal. Does that sound right? So dig outs, and then you'll be able to drive on that and experience it yourself.
Great. And then one thing I was going to suggest, if it's not too big an undertaking, hopefully it's something we'd do anyway in the budget scenarios, is to say, if money were not an object, what would it take to do all the streets? Not that we're going to go that way, but to understand sort of what percentage of the streets are we tackling within the budget that we've got available. Gives us a sense of what our urgency is to be cost effective. If all else being equal, we suddenly felt like, hey, we can get all our streets to PCI 100 in 5 years. Maybe we're not going to be as penny pinching, but I know that's not really going to happen. So for communication purposes, that might be a useful data point or reference point.
We can bring that back in February.
Okay.
I have two different themes I'm wishing the commission deliberating on. So the first is based on my experience, again, 5 years ago with Albany's pavement management program. And there was a planning effort that was done, funded by PTAP. And as a result of that, Albany developed a pavement management contract that it put out to bid. And some of us went and looked out at the streets and said, like it proposed to grind an overlay of Nielsen from Sonoma to Francis. And we looked at Nielsen and it looked fine. So we brought that back to Public Works at that time, and they went out and re-rated the conditions, and half of the blocks, there's 300 blocks of pavement approximately in Albany, half the blocks changed PCI by a whole category, based on the language, not like from 59 to 58, but a whole category, which was extremely perturbing. And Nielsen, the category on Nielsen changed upwards such that it was removed from the pavement project. Now, fortunately, that project, there were no responses to the call for bids, so it didn't go out. So Albany had a chance to remove that. But if it had not been removed and there had been bids and the city had gone forward with it, it would have been wasting money in a spot that was unnecessary. So looking at that as a systemic issue, the grant that Albany received that year for the pavement management planning was $15,000 from PTAP. That's $50 a block. I question whether any consulting firm can do a credible job, not only on the field work, but then on all the data processing and analysis that comes after that for $50 a block. And as was mentioned, let's say Albany spent over those 2 years $1.5 million. That's 1% for planning, and yet that planning is guiding the expenditure of that $1.5 million. So if it's not done right, you're throwing away a huge amount of money. So the perspective I came away from was that the planning side is underfunded by MTC, and I actually met with an MTC staff member to discuss this issue last summer, and she said, well, it was pulling teeth to get the commission to even fund PTAP to this level. And I said, well, if there was support, community support for increasing that funding, would staff be interested in that and amenable to asking for an increase? And she said, absolutely. There's a phenomenon in psychology that's it's been demonstrated by hundreds of experiments. It's consensus, and anybody who's done negotiation knows this, that the first answer that's put on the table anchors the final answer, which means the final answer depends upon the first answer, even though the final answer should have an objective answer. In reality, because of human psychology, it depends on the first answer. So while it can be stated that the amount of funding from MTC for planning is sufficient, I think it's sufficient because local jurisdictions see that funding and say, well, this must be sufficient because MTC is telling us it's sufficient. Whereas if they didn't get any money, then they went out to the consulting world and said, give us, some service bids. I imagine they would come in higher than that, although maybe not because they're perturbed by MTC being out there. But jurisdictions don't tend to top up that money, I think, appropriately. So that's a big area of concern for me. I would be interested in a motion, or I'm thinking of a motion to see if the commission would be interested in developing a resolution to recommend to the council to take a position to MTC that the PTAP should be, some amount more than it has been historically. So that's item one. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
Well, you mentioned, I certainly haven't considered this as long as you have, but just based on what you said and what I've heard earlier this evening, it sounds like $50 of the grant is not what's intended to be spent per block. It would actually be $100 because they talked about a matching grant.
I don't believe it's a matching grant program. So somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know when Albany did this 5 years ago, it took the $15,000 that MTC provided, and that was it, pretty much. It didn't add another $15,000.
Am I wrong in interpreting your presentation that way?
Yeah, there's a matching portion, but it's a small, it's not.
I see, it's not 50-50.
It's not 50-50.
Okay.
It's probably like on the order of 10%.
Right. So the $15,000 is the pot from MTC and the city?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in that case, actually, I think you're right. I think it was 15,000 from MTC, and then the city added 1,500 or 2,000.
Usually it's between 10 and 20%, right?
All right. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
Now, there may be, this may in part be a scaling issue. I mean, if they go strictly by lane miles, there are some fixed costs to running the program and doing everything else, so that smaller jurisdictions, it doesn't scale linearly with lane miles. So it could be that Albany, is specifically underfunded in that regard, and I don't have a good feel for that. And I'm interested in hearing Commissioner Jovindell what your thoughts are about Berkeley. I mean, do you think that's an appropriate amount of money for Berkeley, or do you see sometimes garbage in, garbage out?
I think that part of your point relative to Nielsen, for example, is that we're getting a sampling. We're not getting a measurement of every section of the street. So if it just happened to be the worst part of the street, it might show as poor, even though the street's in fair condition overall. So that is sort of a systemic shortcoming, but it's because, as you pointed out, there's not that much money being devoted to do a really comprehensive assessment. So whether that's something that we can realistically afford to throw more money at to get higher quality, or if it's after the first go round, we kind of say, okay, these are the prioritized streets. Let's go double check those streets specifically. Now it's a much more targeted assessment to make sure, before we proceed on spending money here, let's be sure it's in the category we thought it was in. That may be a better way to go. Because it's a smaller subset rather than expending all the effort on all the streets. But I think there is some value to doing that type of exercise. But yeah, I have to agree with you that the scaling is obviously to our detriment versus a larger organization where kind of the mobilization cost of starting a process is a fixed amount and then a per mile cost. We're not going to do as well on that because a bigger portion of our funding goes to that getting started component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just occurs to me if it is per mile, then Berkeley's getting $50 a block as well, if it's strictly on a per mile base, whatever the number is.
Oh yeah, but that means that the amount of effort it takes to get started is the same between the two cities. And so for Berkeley, we get a lot more for that initial effort.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to clarify, is when we do so I get involved in doing the cost estimates a lot with these PTAP. So we have targets for based on the network size. So less than 50 miles, less than 100, less than 300. We have categories, and so we assign a cost per lane mile because we realize there's an economy of scale. So actually we're not assigning the same value for a small agency. It's much more costly to do a small agency than it is to do a larger agency. You get much more economy of scale. So that is factored in. And I would say the 10% sampling unit, I think the way MTC looked at it is previous to that, the agencies weren't maintaining their pavements at all. They didn't know where their pavements, what their conditions were. They didn't know how to plan. And so they started with something smaller that would be representative on average of the pavement conditions. Because if you went and did 100%, it's 10 times the cost. So their view was it's better to have a pretty good idea of your pavement system than people aren't managing it at all because they're not allocating any funding for it. So, and the 10% sample unit, there is. That's based on the judgment of these technicians. Our technicians, for example, one of our technicians, David Bivens, has been doing this for 20 years. So he's pretty good at it. But sometimes you get a newer technician that's just received training and there's calibration. There's going to be subject to error. I think a good way to capture that, to prevent that error, is to do like a 3 to 5 year pavement plan. So you take the output from Street Savior, you develop a 3 to 5 year plan, and you go out and validate all those streets. You actually have an engineer go out and physically assess every one of those streets in your 3 to 5 year plan and make sure that the treatments that Street Savior is putting out are in fact valid. And that's where you can allocate more funding and time up front to make sure you're on the target before it ever gets to a CIP project, and then you realize, oh, this is the wrong treatment.
How is the sample determined?
So they'll basically drive the 1,000-foot long section or 500-foot section, usually block by block, or 1,000-foot on average, and then they will determine they'll drive it and they'll drive it back, and then they'll determine what they think to be a representative sample unit, and they'll go out and walk it as well. So they'll go out and they think they've picked the right sample unit here, and then they'll walk forward and backward and make sure that they still think it's the right spot, and then they'll do their measurements within that sample unit. So, yep.
So if I could understand, so that they'll drive 1,000 feet, which in Albany would be more than one block, and then they'll pick 10% of that?
They'll pick
10% of the surface area within that drive shed?
At least 10%.
And then they'll do more detailed
Then they'll go
analysis
out,
of that spot.
take off, if it's 1,000 feet, they'll measure off 100 feet, and they'll actually quantify every distress, all those 7 distress types. They'll quantify every one of those with a severity level and a quantity. They just record that. They're not calculating the PCIs. They just record these, and then that gets calculated back in the office or with Street Saver. So they're not going to try to pick the area with the greatest fatigue, and they're not going to try to pick the area with the least amount. They're trying to pick on average what the representative condition is.
So Albany blocks being about 600 feet in the north-south direction.
Yeah, and maybe if we looked at Street Saver, I would bet the sample unit is probably for your agency somewhere between 600 and 800 feet. Or the section length would be somewhere between.
And then 10% of that.
Yeah, some, with counties, they have longer sections because it's not, they're very uniform, and so we break them into larger sections.
When you say that your cost, so you're a consulting firm, obviously. So when you talk about making a bid on a project, and you sort of had that fixed cost side and the scaling cost side, and then you put in a bid.
Right.
But that's not how the PTAP is structured. So in a small jurisdiction, how does that work out for you in terms of bidding? Because the jurisdictions are getting money based on strict linear lane miles, but you recognize there's some fixed costs, and so your bidding could come in quite a bit over or under what MTC is providing.
When we are qualified for the first 3 years of that PTAP grant, so they'll qualify us for a 3-year time or extent, we will submit prices for those particular per lane mile. So we look back, how much did it really cost to do this? And for those blocks of different sizes, we will actually provide on average a per unit cost. Then we'll actually cost it out, plus or minus. Sometimes we're over, sometimes we're under. But it's just it's basically MTC's way of holding us accountable to what we already put together in our initial bid when we put that together. But you look back, they're not, rarely have we gotten pushback on the cost.
And so you give MTC a cost per lane mile for a jurisdiction as you break it into categories by number of lane miles per jurisdiction.
Like San Jose is going to get a much better cost per lane mile than Albany or Berkeley.
Okay, well, so that might inform the motion I want to make, which is that PTAP should take that approach in its granting, rather than being strictly based on, and does it take that approach? I mean, what I'm hearing is it's based strictly on lane miles.
Well, it is based on lane miles, but within those lane miles, they recognize that it costs much more to do the lane miles for a small agency than a larger. So they do that so that we will give a tiered bid. So we'll give, it costs this for less than 50 lane mile agencies, then it costs this amount per lane mile. And we'll tier it, and then they recognize that. So it is scaled based on lane miles.
Because I mean, if I'm hearing that Berkeley, for instance, I don't know, how much does Berkeley get from PTAP? Do you know offhand?
I don't.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned 100,000, but I don't know.
I've costed both. I've done Albany and Berkeley, and my cost for Berkeley was much less per lane mile than it was for Albany, and that was acceptable to MTC. They understood that.
It was, okay. So does MTC so you get pre-qualified, and MTC looks to your pre-qualification to decide how much to grant the cities for doing?
They're always looking to the consultants to make sure that their grant monies are adequate based on the actual cost, because it increases every year with wage increases and other things that force the costs up. So they're constantly taking that into effect, and when you put together that 3-year your 3-year bid, you will set a price for different size agencies. That's scalable.
Because I mean, I guess I'd just come back to, I know Albany got 15,000 5 years ago, and that just doesn't pass the smell test to me. So I'm trying to rectify. Maybe things have gotten better. I don't know, but that number just seems way too low. I don't know how that number strikes you.
Yeah, I would be more than happy, Robert, if we want to spend some time offline. I could show you exactly how we cost it out. I can show you how many sample units we assume, as our production rate per day.
Okay.
And then you can see how it gets costed out.
I don't imagine you would be opposed to jurisdictions pushing for PTAP to be bigger.
The more data you can get, the better the answer. Absolutely.
Okay.
I think what we have now is what I'm saying. I guess it's better than what we didn't have before, which was nothing.
Zero.
People were not doing.
Well, and that's what the NTC staff member said, was like, hey, this was a huge lift to get to here. So,
And it's a model program because most counties or COGs they can't even get their agencies to buy into managing their pavement management.
So I would be interested in becoming more educated so I don't go off ill-informed if I should make a motion at some point in the future. And thank you.
Well, it sounds like it might be appropriate to get some more information and then come back for when the second half of this happens.
Yeah.
It seems to me like you're actually talking about two different things. You're asking questions related to the sort of the review cycle of the pavement and when it sort of a stopgap on making sure that pavement that gets identified through the program actually really needs the treatment that's identified for it. And then the other piece seems to be funding in general for the analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I know those two are interrelated, but those seem to be the two pieces.
So the other theme that I have is Street Saver does not, so you've heard it takes functional classification of the street as one of its inputs. And Justin, I don't know if you could bring up that document that I sent you. So the staff member at MTC sent me a document that kind of lays out the theoretical underpinning of the algorithm in Street Saver that makes the selections or proposes, different street maintenance programs. So this is, similar to the graph that was in the presentation. One of the fundamental assumptions, which I believe is, probably data verified, is that as pavement degrades, it imposes costs upon the users of the street. And so they just took the inverse of that and said, okay, the utility of the street is, basically 1 minus the cost to the user of the street. However, this doesn't vary. This assumes that the cost to users is the same no matter what the mode is. So is the cost of poor pavement to a bus the same as the cost of poor pavement to a personal automobile? I don't know. Is it the same for somebody biking as it is for a personal automobile? I don't know. There's no data. Now, quantitatively, it would be possible to do that risk assessment and to actually build these curves that are risk curves that are based on the relative risk between different modes. There's no reason technically why that couldn't be done. So the Street Saver would actually provide an answer that's based on who is actually using the street. Whereas right now, the functional classification is, if you go to that section 5, weighting factors. So it says, basically streets that are used more, that have more traffic degrade faster. And so the second paragraph says, this weighting should normally be a function of traffic. When traffic data are not available, as is the case, the weighting can be based on functional classification as a surrogate. A functional classification in practice, setting aside this sort of kludge of considering bike routes collectors, functional classification in practice is based only on where motorists going. So a street does not have a street that has a bus route. Well, say take, for instance, Marin and Solano. So Solano has a bus route, Marin doesn't. That makes no difference to the functional classification. So it's not picking up on that. So it's not going to give any preference to two streets are equal. It's not going to give any preference to maintaining the pavement on a street that it's a bus route versus one that isn't. And then as far as the collector, it's what it's going to see in the curves that it puts out is that the collector is going to degrade faster than it really is if it's a bike route. So that's why it's really a kludge, because the collector curve has a faster degradation because it's presuming there's more heavy vehicles that are using it. So it's really giving the wrong answer. I mean, it's just flat out giving the wrong answer. There's all these kind of aftermarket tweaks to try to make it give the right answer. But again, this anchoring phenomena, it's a tool that's not doing a good job. It's giving the wrong answer. And so the final answer that we come up with based on all these sort of afterward adjustments is not going to be as good as if Street Saver was doing the right job. Obviously, you can detect in my voice there's some frustration because I don't know if MTC has made it a requirement, but I know Alameda CTC has made it a requirement that all jurisdictions, in order to receive funding, have to adopt a complete streets policy. I don't know if MTC has that or not.
Isn't that statewide?
I don't know, maybe statewide now, I don't know. I last heard of it from Alameda CTC.
Yeah, it's both MTC and in the general plan, you have to have a statewide general plans have to have the policy as well.
A complete street policy. So MTC is requiring jurisdictions to have a complete street policy, but it is not applying that policy to the tools it itself is developing for jurisdictions to use. I've spent years working on this. I've gotten to the point where the Active Transportation Working Group of MTC will be considering this issue on February 14th at its meeting, which is, I think, from 9:30 to 12:30, if anybody's interested in that. I would be interested in the city or making a recommendation to the council that Street Savers should be taking into account the different modes of transportation in a more scientific manner than it is now.
In its base results, I think you might say.
Well, I mean, in developing the results that it puts out. So it puts out a set of results, and then we do all these kind of, as I say, aftermarket adjustments to try to compensate for these failures. But that's a poor substitute for actually doing the engineering science that should be done to have it put out the right answer from the get-go. And you can still, I mean, you're always going to make adjustments. There's always going to be policy adjustments, but at least it would be an answer that's closer to quantitatively correct.
I agree. I think that, you know, there are certainly deficiencies in it. The question is whether we can get MTC to completely change Street Saver for everybody, or if it's on us to change how we use the results. Because we could go back and try to, you know, perfect the model, or we can apply our own filter to the data in terms of how we use it. Because I do look at the question of, you know, how the model interprets collectors and how we interpret them if they're bike routes. And while the bikes don't have as substantial a detrimental effect on the pavement quality over time as do trucks, bikes are much more sensitive to longitudinal cracking. To me, a bike route with longitudinal cracking has failed. There's no, it's you know, moderate. At that point, it's become potentially hazardous, depending on the size of those cracks. We made a big effort to patch them on Masonic when those occurred. So I think that in some cases our kludge is actually pretty effective in getting us the result we need, because I don't know how much effort it would take to get the base model changed and how precisely it would match up with sort of our priorities versus those of other jurisdictions. So I want to be open-minded as to how much we need to change it versus whether or not we can just keep tweaking how we interpret the data. Because if I look at, slide 26, the food for thought slide, which asks some questions here, I do have some thoughts there that I'd be curious to see if we all feel the same way. I don't know, Robert, if this is something that you want to hear specific comments from us on that slide, or if that's just general to make us think about things.
So part of NCE's task is to generate specific funding scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So based on our direction, we can tell them, and we have told them over the past few months, give us a funding scenario that gets us to 75 PCI. So that informs us in the same way that how much would it take to get to 100. It gives you some information about how to plan your CIP. If there's other direction that we want to give them in terms of local priorities, we can certainly do that, because that informs us about how we can structure our CIP going forward.
Okay, because if we had an optimized model, as Preston suggests would be ideal, then I think a PCI optimizing approach would be the way to go. However, because we don't have that, I think that optimizing our priority treatments is a more useful approach for us to take. But that means we have to define what those priorities are. So some of these questions kind of dive into that. So should we drive the prioritization by district, school zones versus business areas. And, yeah, you've got kids going to schools, but maybe you've got more seniors in the commercial districts. Are they both sensitive receptors and therefore treat them equally because they're both important? Focus on PCI versus focus on functional classification. Like I said, I kind of feel like the functional classification to me is a higher priority. Then the next two seem like a either or. Focus on improving bike routes or reduce the number of streets in a failed condition. And because I hear more comments and I kind of feel like bike routes are a safety and comfort issue that will change the number of people who use biking to get around, and how safe they actually are, that's a higher priority than whether we're allowing some streets to persist in a failed condition longer if those aren't streets that are used extensively by bikes. Now, recognizing bikes can be on any street, so we can't have gravel roads here and there interspersed with the rest of the network. So I look at the question of how do we treat bikes and that they're more sensitive, so elevate them in the prioritization of treatment and then pick the treatments that are going to give them a better surface, which hopefully if there's not a lot of truck traffic on those routes will actually be a good investment because it lasts longer than if we put that same treatment on an arterial where it gets beat up quickly. So that's kind of my quick run through on those.
A follow-up question, does the region, MTC, ACTC, wherever we get our pavement dollars from, do they use the street saver scoring to determine how they distribute the funding? So really it's just us setting priorities?
Now, the funding that we've got is based on, well, it depends on the source. I think the gas tax, and NCE can probably correct me because they know better, gas tax is based on street miles. The Measure B and Measure BB funding from the county, sales tax is based on a population formula.
So it's all formula.
And that one, kind of getting back to this prioritization, when we passed BB, we included in that a requirement that at least 15% of our local streets and roads, which commonly gets used for paving, direct distribution that every city gets annually, should go to bike and pedestrian serving components of street projects. So that fits the complete streets paradigm. And it does, give you some obligation to do that. The other piece is that Street Saver is looking at optimizing how you spend your money based on just the pavement. As was mentioned, it doesn't look at the sidewalks. It doesn't look at the curb ramps. It doesn't look at the drainage necessarily. Although if we want to do complete streets, we're doing all those things. So the model, again, has this major deficiency in terms of how we end up using the money and how far our money goes. Because if we looked at, we've got this much money and Street Saver tells us this, and here's how many streets we can pave, and then we go turn them all into complete streets and go, oh, we can only do half of them. I think we have to be prepared at the outset to know what percentage of our money is actually going to the paving component versus the other pieces.
So in terms of food for thought, my understanding is this things to think about for part 2, so I don't have any, I'm not going to try to weigh in on any of that at the moment.
Well, I think what we're hearing is that that's going to, this is going to influence what they come back to us with.
Is that correct?
Right, so NCE's already run a couple of budget models for us based on maximizing PCI. So if we want to adjust that, do these aftermarket adjustments and ask them to do something that focuses on either bike routes or school zones or something different, we can collectively agree that that's something that we want to pursue, or we can simply, we've already got 2 or 3 budget scenarios that we're prepared to share.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I just feel like it would have been great to get this list before the meeting because I don't feel like I can do it proper justice on the fly in the moment, just the way my brain works. In terms of be pertinent, facilities are pertinent to pavement, taking some of the cost under a complete streets approach. So one of the things the MTC staff member said to me was that Street Saver is being modified to basically inventory everything on the street, curbs, ramps. I don't know about sidewalks, but they mentioned signage. So they are headed in that direction. They are making modifications. So it sort of demonstrates to me they're capable of making modifications. They're willing to make modifications. So I think it's worth asking them to head Street Saver towards a true multimodal PCI approach. So I will make that motion.
Before you do, the documents that we looked at on the screen said something about assessing volume. Do you know if they're headed towards including volume?
Well, NCE could answer. My impression is that it probably can take volume as an input, but most jurisdictions just go with classification, but I don't know.
Yeah, so you can look at ADT and you could actually change your.
I'm sorry, ADT is?
The average daily traffic. So,
Great, thanks.
so you can look at your traffic counts and you could make your functional classification based on traffic count data. So you could calibrate specifically to your local traffic conditions. And then going back to, I think your point is it's an excellent point about complete streets, is I think Street Saver is really focused on how pavements perform with what makes them deteriorate fastest, and that's traffic. So it's predicting the condition of streets and how they'll perform and how they'll deteriorate with traffic. But if you want to bring in policy-specific things, that's what the budget scenarios, that's what that module is for. Because we can go back and do all these different filters. We can focus on AC transit routes, and we can focus on bike routes, or we can make different treatment types for different functional classes or different areas. And then you can see those trade-offs. If I focus only on my bike routes, well, how are my arterials going to fare? If I focus only on my arterials, how are my residentials going to fare? You can make all of those policy decisions and see how those trade-offs work out in real time on your network. So we can do all of that if we have guidance. Absolutely. And then back to the complete street costs, we can build that into the decision tree. So if you want to make it only pavement treatments, only a slurry seal and only an overlay, we'll make the unit cost match that. But if you want to do ramps and you want to do sidewalks and you want to address your drainage just like we did in Berkeley, the cost went from $25 a square yard to $150 a square yard. So now you can tell your public, okay, if you want to do everything, the trade-off is, yes, those streets that we focus on are going to be great, but the rest of your network with the same funding level is going to suffer. And those are the type of decisions we can look at and have all the flexibility. We just need guidance, from this body in terms of what we need to do.
So I think what I heard is that you can use volumes to define functional classification, but the input is functional classification. It can't take volumes directly. There's this tension sort of between what Street Saver does, which is sort of deterministic engineering, and then the policy afterwards. And I've run into this over the years that, well, you can compensate for what Street Saver is doing with policy afterwards. But as an engineering scientist, it is calculable, it is measurable, what is the risk to each mode of each PCI, and then you could have relative risk in Street Saver. So the Street Saver itself is making the decision, because leaving it to policy is a very non-objective means of doing it. So we can say, oh, well, we should maintain all the cycling routes and forget all the arterials, but does that actually make sense in terms of the relative risk to different members of society? And because it is possible to get at that, I can see how to get there. It's hard for me just to leave it to policy. And in terms of changing Street Saver in a way that would then require other jurisdictions to follow on this sort of multimodal PCI idea, well, they should be doing that anyway, because that's complete streets policy. So I don't see that as forcing them to do something that, they should have an option about, although, the software could be built so, you can use flavor A or flavor B. I mean, if MTC wants to give jurisdictions that option, but I would be in favor of every jurisdiction's adopting complete streets policy. So if Street Saver is adjusted and rebuilt to be a complete streets compliance tool, then they should all use it. So again, I'm entertaining a motion to recommend to the city council that it ask MTC to head Street Saver towards a true multimodal pavement management tool.
Yeah, with the recognition that's not going to impact our short term, I second that, because as a long-term goal, that's a good thing for them to do.
You got to start somewhere. So.
Any other discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Motion carries.
Thank you very much.
Can
And then back to the.
can we interpret that as a second?
Yes,
Oh, yeah,
that was the intent.
I'm sorry.
Absolutely. No, I just wanted to be clear that I didn't then expect that to change everything that we've already discussed for this go-round.
Oh, yeah. No, I see this taking 10 years probably, realistically. I mean, my experience of getting change through government is 7 years is the median.
For local changes.
For local changes, right. And this is a regional change, so I haven't even begun to touch that before, so I can only imagine.
So returning to this food for thought sled and thinking about, are there other comments from the commission on what you'd like to see considered in the next presentation in terms of trade-offs or focus of a paving program? Fareed had some comments.
Said plenty. I'm done.
If you say so. Okay. No, fair enough, Robert.
Well, if we're looking at what to do in the short term and figure out what the trade-offs are, then we should try to focus in the short term on trade-offs that look at all the alternative modes of transportation. So whether that's bike, I guess it's just bike and transit in the city.
Well, bike, transit, personal automobile.
As you prioritize. Yeah.
I too would like to see some sort of trade-off metric between those, and so that we can take a crack at figuring out what we want to recommend. Having said that, I don't have any particular.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for answers on. I'm sorry. I'm looking to staff to come up with some ways to show us how those trade-offs could take effect.
Can I add one more thing? Should we also look at what the proposed bike routes are and whether or not we have to set priorities on any bike facilities that are not built yet? I don't know if there are any in the active transportation plan, or are we all out?
Now, most of them, well, at least half have not been striped or signed yet, so.
And part of that, what I'm getting to is that I think most cities, they take advantage of repaving to do restriping. And so the last thing you want to do is be off in terms of your timing of your active transportation plan and your paving plan, where you just paved and then you, set a different classification for a street and you want to restripe that, but then the road was paved, a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
Staff can certainly take that into consideration. This last round, we just put in finished design and put out awarded a construction contract, had slurry seals and striping together. Mm-hmm. Going back to your comment, or perhaps, Robert, your first one, I think for Street Saver, and I'll sit down with NCE tomorrow to discuss this further, but I think for Street Saver, the surrogate is, if you identified it as a bike route, then that is your stand-in for informing what would prioritize transit over a local residential street that's not identified as a bike route. We can go and look at specific AC transit routes. There's a small enough number in the city that we can look at how that's affected.
Again, in that regard, I think all the transit routes are arterials, so there's nowhere to go to make them higher weighted.
Right.
So there's no way to weight Solano over Marin. And again, I'm not comfortable really doing that from a policy perspective anyway. I think it should be risk-based. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your sort of anecdotal impression, if you have any, or the agency has any, on what poor pavement does to buses. But
We've come across a lot of those issues here at this commission with poor pavement and their impact on transit, on the comfort of the ride as well as the vehicle itself. So Monroe Street. Oh, sorry. Monroe Street was an example, right, where the potholes is Pierce Street also arterial?
Let's see.
Those are the only.
It's shown as a collector.
Okay, so it's
on this
Buchanan,
map.
Pierce, Solano, and San Pablo.
Yeah, so Pierce is a collector.
Correct.
And going back to this issue with the CRS.
Yeah, a little small piece right there.
Going back to this issue with the CRS, so for instance, it has Cornell as a collector. It has Key Route south of Solano as an arterial. You mentioned that staff did not want to downrate what the CRS functional classification was. Is that a policy decision, or is that like a legal requirement?
I don't believe it's a legal requirement. This is really, Street Saver is a tool for us to use at a regional level.
Okay, so I would be in favor of throwing out whatever the CRS says, because to me it doesn't make any sense to say that Cornell's a collector. I mean, if anything is a collector, it's the streets that have the four-way stops, which would either be Talbot and Stanage. People don't use Cornell preferentially because every single street you got a two-way stop and you got to deal with cross traffic. So I think the CRS, I don't know what it's based on. As well as Key Route south of Solano. So I think the CRS is going to lead Street Saver awry, in terms of these particular ones. So I would say just use the ATP and the general plan, and then maybe consideration of transit, but do not use CRS. How does that sound?
Yeah.
I suspect that the CRS may predate when we put in the four-way stops on those streets. So prior to that, perhaps Cornell was preferred route, but as you pointed out, now you don't have that easy crossing of Washington and Portland, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's going on 20 years ago now. So it's pretty out of date.
Yeah, well, that's just, I don't know how and when it gets updated. So it may be that it's stale, or maybe it just uses criteria that differ from what we're thinking.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Go with the local knowledge.
Curtis, north of Portland?
Yeah. So random.
How did that happen?
Is that a collector, Robert? You live right there.
It's not very different.
Maybe you have to recuse yourself now.
Yeah, right. Now I can't talk about it.
So I would just, question that one.
Well, I think just blanket.
Right.
Just throw the CRS out.
Right.
I think we understand what's going on with our local plans.
That's
I
strange.
don't think we need to make a motion.
No, we'll just take that as direction.
Great. Seems to be mostly consensus or indifference here.
And then on the food for thought, another part of what led me to dive into Street Saver so deeply was, it was explained 5 years ago because people were concerned about the condition of Washington at that time, that while Washington was in such poor condition, the Street Saver would never propose repairing Washington, because you could spend your entire year's budget repairing that section of Washington. Obviously not great since it's a cycling route, and it's like really approaching a moonscape between Masonic and Key Route at this point. I don't know what to do about that. Again, as you can tell, I prefer sort of an objective quantitative approach. So I'm not just saying, well, whatever happens, Washington should be redone, but it is kind of disturbing that it would have that outcome. So again, that might be a problem with the algorithm, and I hate to try to do something about that with policy after the fact.
Please.
For the benefit of the commission, prior to Preston's sitting on this commission, staff decided to proceed with design and construction for improvements on Washington between San Pablo and Key Route. So one way to manage the large cost it would take to invest is to take smaller segments of the street. So you don't have to identify a large section of Washington and then price that out so that it's never impacted. You can chunk that out into smaller sections, and then one of those might rise eventually. But Street Saver the algorithm is designed for cost effectiveness first. So you're going to invest in slurry seals over a lot of other treatments because they're so cost effective.
Right, and I guess this is where I'm interested in the objective alteration of Street Saver, because if you figured out an objective function for risk to different modes, and you said that's a cycling route, then you could actually get an objective answer on what is the cumulative or summation risk to society of letting it be in its failed state.
Perhaps a more objective answer?
More objective answer. Yeah.
We're not talking perfect, right?
I've been accused of being a perfectionist.
I do think we should probably move along, though. So I think you have plenty of input.
I would agree with you.
Great, good. We've been successful then. That's good. Thank you very much for the presentation and the answers, and to staff for developing the project. And we look forward to seeing you back again. Thank you. And we'll make sure to allocate plenty of time. With that, I would like to move along to item number 5.2, the proposed school loading zone on Masonic Avenue.
Thank you.
And we will have a couple of speakers on this, or public comment.
This proposal is related to the curb management plan for the Albany Middle School Annex. In addition to the loading zone designations adjacent to the school buildings, the commission recommended that staff evaluate the potential for a loading zone designation on Masonic Avenue.
Is it Masonic or Masonic?
So we're talking along here. This loading zone would allow parents to drop off and pick up children while avoiding the congestion on Brighton Avenue and avoid the heaviest traveled crosswalk at the intersection of Brighton and Masonic, where the Albany Greenway crosses Brighton. The existing city vehicle parking designation is no longer needed at this location. Staff is proposing to extend the red curb for intersection visibility and combine the remaining loading areas into a 3-minute drop-off pickup loading zone with consistent white curb and signage. This is what it looks like today. Currently, there is a short stretch of red curb at the drain inlet, a longer white curb that's signed for city vehicle loading from noon to 6 p.m., and then no white curb in this stretch, but a sign stating that it's 3-minute loading parking to the left of that sign. So what we're proposing, this is sort of mock-up of the footage of the 90 feet, extending the red curb for visibility, and then consistent white curb for the remainder for school loading, 3-minute loading zone. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
When will this get done? And who?
We can make this change as soon as the school is still, the annex is still being completed, but this could be used at any point, and the school could let parents know of the change. So yeah, it wouldn't have to wait for the annex to open.
Okay. Please.
So I've been to a lot of school district meetings lately, very contentious, and was wondering who was noticed for this improvement?
Sure. So I sent via email to the residents along San Gabriel that have been participating in our earlier discussions about the annex site and the curb management, and then mailed notices to the block down to Garfield of Masonic, and noticed the apartment building here east of the intersection and back up to 1 block west along Brighton.
And there was no public written comments or anything?
The woman that was here earlier does manage the apartment building, so apparently she went home, but.
No, I received no.
We had 2 public comment cards for this item, and I think one of those 2 people has left, unless he's outside. Brian, you out there?
And then reading through the staff report, I noticed that all of the loading in front of the middle school the times would be changed. I read that correctly?
Yeah, so at our earlier discussion, there was discussion that the current posted times aren't most suited to the actual loading and pickup and drop-off needs. And so I was proposing that this be consistent with what we decided for the signs for the rest of the area.
And I noticed that there was a 4 p.m. limit, and was wondering I know the school ends at 3:05, and was wondering if 3:30 was considered, or did the district request 4 o'clock, or if there was thoughts about that?
There was some discussion at the commission meeting. I'd have to look if, I think because there are after-school programs, that there was some discussion around having a slightly longer block, that there isn't a huge need for someone to be arriving home to park there, to make it 4 versus 3:30, to give more time for the more varied pickup times. But there wasn't a lot of discussion around it, but that was what the recommendation was.
And did the district have any comments about the drop-off times? School district.
The superintendent, and I believe maybe one of the principals, was there at the discussion, but we haven't corresponded with them since then, other than that was the timing that had been decided at the earlier.
If I remember, this timing jived with what they were saying at the meeting. Question?
Yeah, I was curious, you asked about the city's outreach. I was curious, was there like some concern behind that, other than just a general concern for making sure the public was informed?
You know, I don't believe the neighboring residents didn't have concerns about the city outreach. It was the school district, and so I just wanted to confirm everybody's doing outreach.
Yeah. So I know I got a card. I don't know why. Maybe that's because I'm on some list now. I don't imagine it's because where I live. Okay, fair enough.
We generally mail notices to the commissioner, so you know what is being sent out to the public.
Okay.
And that's a new thing, and it's very appreciated.
Okay, good. Because I was like, wow, they're really noticing this like far and wide. They've really gotten, fear put in them. I was wondering if you could put up the parking occupancy survey figure for Masonic. So a question is 70 feet, that's kind of like 3.5 vehicles? It strikes me as kind of an odd number, particularly when I think people in loading zones may not park quite as carefully as parallel parking in terms of packing themselves into the space. So this is a parking occupancy survey I did actually with my kids. They were 10. This is from 2010. In relation to the Albany Greenway getting rebuilt because of the BART size and retrofit. But I think the data is just anecdotally from my observations of the street still valid. So what you've got here is Masonic. You're looking west, essentially. Masonic's, running horizontally, and then you've got the cross streets vertically. And so these are different blocks. And the graph is the parking occupancy if there was parking allowed only on the west side of the street. So this was looking at if you close parking on the east side, could the west side accommodate it? And it's 3 different times a day. It's morning, noon, and night. So you're sort of capturing all the different uses. So anywhere there's the 100% line, anywhere it's over 100%, you couldn't close the parking on the the east side because you need that parking. But the upshot for this agenda item is looking all the way to the right at Brighton. Actually broke the survey into two pieces between Garfield and Brighton because the use changed so much. So you can see at the half of the block near Brighton in the morning, high parking occupancy. That's that sort of lime-colored point. But then the next half block back, the parking occupancy is very low. I mean, even if all the vehicles were parked on the west side of the street, they would only occupy 60% of the spaces on the west side of the street. So what does all this mean? Means there's plenty of parking, just a half a block back from the intersection. So I kind of wonder about making the loading zone longer than 70 feet. I don't know what, is how length to integers of vehicles, what the relationship is. You might have some thoughts off the top of your head on that. But I know these loading zones oftentimes, because the school district doesn't have anybody out there moving people along, and the city doesn't do that, people park there for longer than 3 minutes. So it seems like putting more capacity in there might be beneficial, given that there's all this unused space otherwise, just so close by. So I'd be interested in anybody's bid on how long it should be or what makes sense, but there's no clear answer.
I have an alternate proposal, but and solution, but it ends up being more of an opinion, so I'm going to wait until later.
Good.
I think that when I think about a loading zone at a school, I think that at an elementary school, you would get people stopping for longer. Maybe a child needs help getting out of the car seat and all that stuff. But with middle school, man, you just pull over and push them out and move along. I mean, well, that's just what I do with my son. I don't know what other people do. So I feel like, looking at the different types of school, the loading zone may operate slightly differently.
So this may actually be an elementary school loading zone for a period of 5 years, 4 to 5 years. So, but I agree about middle school students. Parent, leave my area as soon as possible. I don't want to be seen with you. Other questions?
A follow-up to Preston's, do we have the ability to make a decision to increase the size of the loading zone and reduce the number of parking spaces without renoticing the public?
Yes, we noticed that we were considering curb management changes.
Okay.
We stated that this was what staff was proposing, but this is what we're considering. I mean, if we were going to make a dramatic change beyond that, we would probably want to go talk to more people again.
And we can also monitor and see how it goes. Either way, we can extend it, and then if we don't need it, if there's demand for regular parking, then we can change it, or the other way around. So I think we can.
I would just say our initial intent with what is here is this is repurposing what's been not very clearly or usefully designated currently. If it gets a lot of usage, we could always expand the loading zone beyond what it is currently being proposed. We did look at occupancy on the north block, sort of north from Garfield. It's generally pretty filled up, either between BART users or teachers or whatever. It does usually get pretty full towards Garfield, and then is pretty open for the southern half of the block. So we looked at, there was some discussion about other loading zones further south. Because of the lower parking occupancy on that stretch, it doesn't seem like you really need to designate it for that there is already availability for that purpose if you wanted to load a little further away. But our inclination was to start smaller and then could always expand if we were getting successful utilization.
If there are no further questions from the commission, let's open it up to the public. And Harry, I have your card.
Good evening, Harry Chomsky again. Well, thanks for looking at this. I don't really have any comments about the loading zone that's proposed. I think it's fine. As far as it goes, I think it will improve safety because people won't be stopping in the middle of the street to drop their kids off as they do now. I don't really think it'll improve congestion. I think the congestion, in my experience, was driven, so to speak, by the intersection of Masonic and Masonic and Brighton, where there is pretty much a continuous stream of children using the crosswalks, and the cars just never get a chance to move, and then they kind of inch their way in and push their way through in a manner that's probably not very safe, but I think many of them feel they have no other choice. And all of these people that are using this new loading zone are going to be traveling through that same bottleneck intersection. So what I would hope is if we're going to have, if we're going to try to reduce congestion, I think the solution is a multi-pronged effort to convince people driving their kids to school that they don't need to drop them off right at the school. And that has to come from the school district, of course, and it has to come from the students telling their parents, drop me off 2 blocks away, drop me off 3 blocks away, you're embarrassing me. We have to have a cultural change. But I was hoping that the city could contribute to that effort by just creating this visual sense that there are places to drop your kid off that are excellent places where the parent can save maybe 5 or 10 minutes out in the process by not having to go through that bottleneck intersection. And that's why I recommended the spot just south of Garfield where the Albany Greenway actually comes right up to the curb. And for me, that was beneficial because the grass is usually wet. And if you drop a kid off and they have to walk, the first thing they have to do when they get out of the car is walk across the grass to get to the Greenway, then their feet are wet for the whole day. It's a small thing, but it just seemed like if we want to encourage both the school and the community to start thinking about dropping off in a more sensible way for our community, that having that additional loading zone was one thing we could do. Maybe there are other ideas people have about what can the city do to really start this behavioral change. Thanks.
Thank you. Seeing no other public comment, I'll bring it back to the commission. And I have to say that I'm perfectly aligned with Harry. I too believe that avoiding the intersection of Brighton and Masonic at all costs is the key to morning happiness when you are forced to drive, which I hardly ever drove my children to middle school, but that's another thing. So I think a communication, at the very least, from the school district, along with communication about the loading zone change, that there is plenty of space to pull over on the Masonic south of Garfield on the east side so that you can turn onto Garfield. And yeah, you still have to go past Portland if you're coming back around, but you know, a much better solution for many people.
I don't understand why people drop their kids off in front of the middle school. I've never dropped my kid off in front of the middle school. He has to walk 2 blocks. That's the closest I'll go. But I agree with you if there's a way to encourage people to, and it's not just the middle school, it's the elementary schools too. If we could get people to not go right to the front of the school and drop their kids off 2 blocks away, that would be great, but I'm not sure if we can make that happen.
I've been working on it for 10 years, and it's pretty intractable, but there's some ways you can do encouragement. I told my kids in I think, middle school, okay, you've been walking to elementary school, that's great. It's a little further to middle school. You can ride a bike. I will give you a ride 1 time a week. And that worked out pretty well. Usually they didn't take me up on it, but when they needed it, it was there. So I like to encourage people to do that.
I'm intrigued by the suggestion to put the loading zone at and south of Garfield and actually convert this area to parking. So people actually park there and block it off. So if people are going to use the loading zone, they have to actually use the spot behind Garfield. What do you think in your 10 years of experience? Would that be persuasive to people or not persuasive?
I'll have to think about that. Probably overall, you're going to still have people who want to be closer. And as Harry said, there's a tendency for people to let the kids open the doors while they're in the traffic lane, stopped in traffic. It's a very strong draw. I think you will be encouraging more people to do that.
So on balance, I mean, so it's not binary. You're not going to get everybody to drop off at Garfield. You're not going to get nobody to drop off at Garfield. There's going to be something in between. So kind of on balance.
On balance, well, you have to consider that because there is currently a loading zone, it's a taking in some way, and you're really challenging people to accept the change. I've traditionally used more encouragement forms of, and so communicating how people could better their lives and improve their morning seems more convincing than saying, ha ha ha, we're going to force you to behave better.
Yeah, there's also the issue of that there is no crossing to the greenway paths there, and that the walking path is adjacent to the multi-use path, so it's not on the street side.
I agree.
The ATP actually has an element or a project to provide a connection across there, but that hasn't been done yet. So yeah, I think in the wintertime, tracking across that's not necessarily as desirable. I don't know.
Yeah, there's some of
I
that.
rode in the rain as a kid, so what do I know?
Right, I
Still
think
riding the
kids are
rain, so what do I know?
A little less sensitive to that. Also, it occurs to me that in any case, the red zone is probably going to increase there.
Yeah.
And that's a drop-off zone. So if you don't put a drop-off zone behind the red zone, that's what the red zone is for. It's like at the pool.
That sounds like you're in favor of keeping it at the intersection and.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll put 100 feet on the table rather than 70. Which would be about
How long is the whole block from Garfield to approximately? A couple hundred feet?
600 feet from Garfield to.
600? Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And also, whoever's parking there, I don't get the sense, they're not parking like in front of their residence. They're parking and walking somewhere anyway. I don't know if it's people in the apartment or where
Bart parking.
What a fine, they can
I used to
walk
park there,
another
for Bart, yeah.
30 feet.
Other opinions?
Yeah. Everything that's been observed, I agree. I see it all the time. I'm always much happier when we bike there rather than drive, which tends to be the wet weather solution, unfortunately. But I see a couple different behaviors. One is people do want to pull over to drop off their kids if they can. They seem to want to try to get as close to the intersection as they can before they do that. So if they pass open spaces, just past Portland, like, I'll find one further down, I'll find one further down, and then they get to a point where it's like, oops, I didn't find one. Now it's, school's about to start, I can't spend the next 5 minutes getting to the intersection, so the kids routinely hop out of the car and cross the parking lane to get to the sidewalk or to the greenway. So definitely you see that drop off in the traffic lane, which makes me anxious in the event that there are any bikes that are on the street rather than on the greenway. The other thing that I see is the folks who've done that and still don't want to wait all the time to get to the intersection, so they tend to make U-turns and go back the other way. And to the extent that that's fewer cars crossing with kids at the intersection, I'm actually okay with it. Generically, I'm not thrilled with that, but
It's a double yellow line, yeah.
all things considered. But what that leads me to, the reason I'm kind of marching through all this, is the idea of a white zone before Garfield. So now I'm not guessing, how far do I go before I find the last space? It's like, no, I know the white zone is there. Before Garfield, I drop off my kid, I can make a left turn down Garfield to get out of this mess and not contribute to the congestion at Brighton and Masonic. I like that. I agree, some people are still going to want to go get as close as they can, especially if they've got time, they're there earlier. I kind of feel like we need 2 white zones. Maybe it's 50 feet just south of Garfield and another 50 feet at the intersection, or some number. But in terms of your question earlier, Preston, about how much space, I mean, a typical parking space is 22 feet, but for high turnover, bump it up to 25. So 50 feet will get you 2 cars. But I think if we do both, we're giving people options, making it a little bit easier to get the behavior that hopefully we want to see, without eating up all the parking.
And you're a traffic engineer, and I am only a weary advocate, so.
No, we all see this. I think our observations of what's going on out there are equally valid, certainly. And, as users of the facility at various times and under different circumstances, all of these things are definitely worth taking into consideration. I'm just, I do like the idea of trying to give people a defined opportunity. This is kind of the carrot approach, saying, hey, if you don't want to go get in that mess down at the intersection, drop off back here, and hey, we just made it easier for you with the designated white zone that you don't have to guess where you're going to find a parking space. There's one here that's high turnover. I think that's good. I am flexible on how many spaces we put in each one of the white zones.
What did staff mean by the paragraph addressing this in the staff report? It says that you observe greater parking availability south of Garfield and is not recommending additional loading zone designations between Garfield and Portland at this time. So that it's possible, but it's just not recommended right now? Is that?
Yeah, so we were saying that generally there's availability south of Garfield, so we didn't see the need for designating space, that
Got it,
there's
okay.
usually space there.
Okay. So it may not
Counterpoint
be
to that,
necessary.
if you want us to go notice them and bring that back, we're happy to do that. There shouldn't be a huge amount of pushback on the flip side because there's generally availability on that side of the street.
I do agree with that. It's just, maybe I'm projecting on other people. This is like my optimization effort, is how close can I get before I pull over? Versus it's like, we know there's spaces, but we've stuck all the open spaces in one spot so you know where to find them. Maybe that'll change people's behavior. Hopefully it would change mine.
So my only thoughts about having a loading zone by Garfield is that just, I feel people think that as an obvious loading, unloading zone for the middle school because it is over the middle school is now over a block walk. It just doesn't, it doesn't read to me as obvious. This is where I would pull over to drop my kids off who still have to walk a block and a half. Not that I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I'm just providing a counter view.
Big signage. Would we have to renotice?
For that, yeah.
So maybe we could concentrate tonight on the size of the proposed, and then if you would like to propose that as a future agenda item, we can revisit it.
I do think expanding what's there now would be advantageous. The more we can get
How much?
cars to.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to move things along.
No,
here.
70 feet or 100 feet. I'm okay with either one. I think.
I hear 100, 100, 100. Anybody? 100, 100. So 100 feet has been proposed. And
I'll make a motion to move it along.
Yeah.
Move that the
Second.
loading zone be 100 feet with the 20 feet of red curb to the north of it.
Second that.
We have a second from Fareed. Comments on the proposal? Discussion?
My personal opinion is we should go with what staff recommended and see how it operates, and we could always come back and extend it if it's so popular that is the place to drop your kid off, that we would want to extend it. But I think 70 feet is good because it is a change for the neighbors. I think parking is allowed in the morning now, but would not be with the change in the drop-off times. Because I think the loading is 12 to 6 currently. Was that?
Currently, the area that's identified
Yeah.
for city vehicles
Yes.
is prohibited 12 to 6.
Yeah. So my thoughts would be stick with the 70 feet and then assess and see if it's being utilized and there is a lot of use, and then maybe extend it at that point.
Okay. Any other discussion? All in favor of the proposed of the proposal? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Motion carries. I think that puts this one to rest, and we'll talk about, when we talk about future agendas later.
Yep. 100 feet.
100 feet, with 20 feet of red curb. Oh, all right. Good. Thank you, Harry.
Okay.
Okay, so should
can
we
reconsider.
re-vote, or would you like to change your vote? Yeah, and no, it's really okay. It's going to carry one way or another. So if you would like to say if you would like to say that you actually object to the,
It's okay.
I would be happy to second that motion as well. We can vote on them in sequence if we want to do that. Because I really don't care between 70 and 100,
I see.
just to be clear. I do want us to move one of these. Staff has a proposal out there. I think you make a valid point.
4 for 100, I will, I'll support this.
Well, why don't I suggest that you change your vote to an abstain?
I'm okay.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You had the option, no problem.
I'm a pro-loading zone, so.
Nobody is thinking you weren't, yes. And I'm sorry if we moved a little too fast or we're not clear. And please feel free to stop us at any time.
Can we take 5-4 in advance of 5-3 for the next
Sure.
agenda item?
Yes, absolutely. So we're moving to item number 5-4, electric scooters in Albany and proposed deployment by Lime.
That's why you're here.
Thank you. Yes, we have someone that's been waiting patiently. So I was just going to give a brief overview and hand it over. I wanted to note that state regulations, since we've talked a little bit about this previously, have changed a little bit. AB 2989 went into effect January 1st, which changed 2 rules for motorized scooters. One, helmets are now only required for those under the age of 18. And 2, a local authority can authorize their operation on streets with a speed limit of up to 35 miles per hour. I believe it was 25 miles per hour prior to that, though 15 mile per hour speed limit is still applicable for the scooters themselves. And local jurisdictions can further regulate their operation and parking. Currently, our city regulations regulate them as motor vehicles, following the rules of the road. Additionally, motorized scooters are called out as prohibited on Albany Hill and waterfront areas, where sort of for recreational trail kind of use, that kind of thing, it's prohibited. With that, staff is inclined to give Lime the go-ahead to deploy here. Prohibiting the deployment would require city council action. Issues that could be addressed under existing city regulation through public nuisance law. Additional regulatory measures could be developed and implemented as needed. Permit programs in other jurisdictions have intended to address a variety of issues with motorized scooters, including cost recovery, new infrastructure, ensuring proper vehicle maintenance, equitable access, data, privacy, and user behavior. So as these are issues that we want to take up and develop policy, those are the kind of areas that other jurisdictions have been looking at with their regulations. We can attempt to answer any questions regarding policy or discussions on the regulatory side. Representatives from Lime are here to give a brief presentation on their proposed deployment. I loaded on the computer there if you want to open up the, I'll switch it over.
Sorry, I haven't used a PC in a while.
Would you prefer I control it from over here?
It's a handicap, isn't it?
Would you prefer I open it over here and control? Okay.
Find me the third slideshow.
So top line, yeah, hit that tab, and then there should be a, there you go.
Thank you. So this is just kind of a brief overview about our scooter program, and then I can talk about Albany-specific deployment. I think I'll just, one caveat is that it doesn't really make sense, and we discussed this, for us to completely deploy in Albany until Berkeley does so. Tomorrow we're submitting our RFP application, and so we'll have those results hopefully sometime before March. Basically, you're probably familiar with Lime. We're a Bay Area company. We're based in San Francisco now, and we have a program called Lime Access that provides lower income users with discounted rides, and as well as cash payments and text to unlock. And we have a lot of local partnerships, specifically with Bike East Bay and Marshawn Lynch's kids' charities in Oakland. So I just wanted to put this data from Oakland up because we basically have been operating in Oakland since, I'd say, August, and we've already had about 700,000 rides on scooters alone. The average daily trip is probably somewhere between 4,000 to 7,000 rides. The peak usage rate is around commuting time, specifically evening commutes from BART stations is our biggest use case. And we've had 123 unique riders, as well as a median trip time of 7 minutes, or around probably a little over a mile. So a lot of people are using it in Oakland to complete that first last mile as a part of their commute, and it's becoming a daily user habit.
Do you get a lot of people going to the airport?
No.
Okay. There's a dot there on it.
Yeah, I'm sure people probably will take it to the airport. Lime, we pick it up in Walnut Creek from Oakland and Contra Costa County. So wherever there's a demand, a scooter will probably end up. So right now, this is a very basic deployment proposal for Albany. Obviously, it's not set in stone. I don't want to flood the city with scooters to start because we'll have scooters in Berkeley and Oakland and eventually El Cerrito. And because scooters are transit, they move. So we want to be able to fluctuate that dynamic kind of fleet base. And also, I didn't know that scooters weren't allowed on the Bay Trail, but I also want to keep them away from the water because we have seen issues of vandalism, specifically in Lake Merritt. So we pulled our deployment from around Lake Merritt by about 2 blocks and saw a reduction in our scooters being thrown into the water. Actually, we went from we retrieved, and with Lake Merritt Institute, 60 scooters, not just Lime, but Bird and Skip as well, in October from the lake. And this month, we've only retrieved 2. And that was after altering our deployment strategy, setting up a patrol, as well as creating a no parking or riding zone around the lake, as well as deployment from our contractor workforce. Do you guys have any questions about this proposed deployment or any thoughts?
So when you say deployment, is the idea that scooters will be repositioned at those locations periodically, or what is deployment mean?
So the idea is that so every day scooters are deployed in the morning before rush hour because they have to be charged at night. And so we like to have starting places for them to be deployed, which are called hotspots. And each hotspot has a allocation of how many vehicles, and that really depends. Usually our hotspots ideally have 3. In smaller communities or smaller areas, we'll probably put 2 per hotspot. And then we change it based on demand as we collect data over time. We'll use heat maps and different algorithms to figure out where do we need to alter our deployment strategy and where do we need to rebalance to, and what are the top hotspots to be focusing on, or what are the hotspots that we have 3 scooters sitting at idle for several hours, and figuring out where else to put those to meet the demand.
Are you basing this then on your bike data, or is this just
This is kind of based on like, so I actually, when we do like an initial deployment, we do it based on like bus stops, because a lot of people are using them to commute to and from bus stops, as well as it's based on some other previous data of like, you know, where city centers are, and a lot around like places to eat, because that is usually a good factor, an indicator historically of where there is demand. So anywhere people are entering or exiting a building, an apartment building, or a cafe, or the public library, usually are places that we will target, because, you know, we want to cut down on those short car trips. I just wanted to share some stats that we've collected. The city of Portland had a really good study during their pilot program that our scooters replaced car trips, and 34% instead of taking a car or Uber, they took us, as well as I think the biggest like thing to take away from scooter ridership is that the majority of riders probably have never used a docked-based transit system. They probably have never used bike share. And scooters are kind of opening up access to people who may not be familiar with alternative ways of transportation outside of a car or AC Transit or BART. Also, this week actually is our 1-year anniversary of having scooters deployed in San Jose. It was our first scooter program. And when we first launched in San Jose, we launched at a really low rate of around 50 scooters. Now we're at probably around 2,000 in the city, and we see ridership around probably 8,000 rides on a Friday. Fridays typically to be our highest days of ridership. Fridays and Saturdays. Sundays are actually interestingly lower. And a lot of that is around commute and people going out as well. And the Mineta Institute did a study about compliance with regulations, and 97% of the scooters that they surveyed in San Jose were actually correctly parked. So just like when...
I'm sorry, they were what?
Correctly parked.
Correctly parked.
So, you know, not obstructing an ADA ramp, not in the way of foot traffic, and on the furniture side of the street. So basically this demonstrates that, you know, there is a learning curve, and over time, as like this product becomes a part of people's everyday life, the behavior gets reinforced and it becomes more normalized and more compliant with local regulations.
How do you know that the 90%, 7%, it's that accurate?
Well, because the Mineta Institute went out over like a month and
so they did visual
physically
observations.
went and checked on scooters in San Jose. Yes. This is just basically a slide about our operations. A lot of scooter companies have 1099 contractors. We do have 1099 contractors, but we also have a local operations team that's employed by Lime. We have a warehouse in West Oakland that serves the East Bay, and we have around 50 operations specialists who work in the fields doing patrol, deploying, rebalancing, and retrieving scooters, as well as charging them. And then we have a team of our own in-house mechanics. Very quickly, because it's late, we have a Respect the Ride campaign. We have distributed 250,000 helmets to riders around the world. We also have a new scooter coming out that's more robust. It has an LED screen on the scooter that will show eventually directions that are integrated into the screen, as well as warning messages and safety tips, so the user doesn't have to interact with their phone, which they would have to do now to do a tutorial. They can just do it right there while they're riding the scooter, as well as you know, kind of creating a carrot to get people to take bike infrastructure. So we would have directions on the scooter that prioritize, much like when you take the Google bike, like Google Maps bike, it would prioritize the usage of these bike pathways, so people would be encouraged to ride in the street instead of the sidewalk. This is just an example of our in-app tutorial that people have to go through before they operate a scooter. Also, we have the ability to geofence areas where people will get fined for parking scooters, and if they're repeat offenders, we're not above kicking them off of our service, as well as, you know, a no riding zone or deployment zone, meaning that like our team or our juicers can't deploy in these areas, which we've done around Lake Merritt, for instance.
Who monitors that? Is that the app or is that the police that are?
We monitor, the app does. So if people park in a certain GPS location, they will get fined for it.
By you guys?
Yes, by us.
Okay.
If I can interrupt for just a moment, I need a motion to continue the meeting.
Motion to continue to, what do we have left here?
10:30 maybe?
Yeah. I'll motion to continue the meeting till 10:30.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Again, this is our Lime Access Program. It's our equity partnership. We use Pay Near Me, so you can go to any Walgreens or 7-Eleven, use cash to add value to like a Lime wallet. Also, they have a text to unlock feature, so users don't have to have a smartphone to access Lime. And we have a team that uses like any kind of low-income program that someone's a member of to verify. We're not really in the business of like, you know, deciding who's in or who's out. So it's a pretty generous low-income assistance program. That's it for tonight.
Great. Preston.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you for having me.
For creating your service and bringing it here. If you could go back to the deployment plan, please.
Of course.
So if I understand correctly, this is where scooters initially are proposed to be located in the morning or relocated overnight, put back out in the morning, so that's where they would be.
Correct.
So for that, I mean, rather than being along the arterials primarily, I would think having more of these spots that are actually in the
side streets.
Yeah, sort of. I was thinking like if you look at where the four-way stops are throughout the city, because then you're kind of in a quadrant, you know, there's a lot of houses serving that, and people are going to be going to using them either to go to BART from there or to go to the bus stop. There was information presented to this commission, I don't know, a couple of years ago that the bus stop, the 72 bus stop at Solano and San Pablo has about 4,000 passengers a day on each side that alight and get on and off, or no, they're going through, I guess. I think it's
going
like-
through. It's probably going through.
It's like 1,000.
You're in the hundreds for ons and offs. For people waiting.
Yeah, I thought it was like 1,000, but anyway, it's a lot. But anyway, so people could be heading there, so I'm not saying put the scooters there, because obviously they're heading to the bus in the morning. One thing I've often wondered with Lime's service and rebalancing is that I'm always surprised that there aren't like 50 bikes at El Cerrito BART station at 3 o'clock, because it just seems like, you know, I mean, obviously there's a cost to getting all the bikes there.
Yeah.
But if I have my druthers, you know, the locations would be kind of in amongst the housing in the morning, and in the evening they'd be at the transit stations.
So initially for deployment, we don't like to target residential areas just because people aren't always receptive to scooters. So we want it to become more of a norm before introducing it into like these smaller, more confined areas where people might feel like more upset about it.
Okay.
But definitely like in some cities, we do deploy on the side streets instead of the main strip. It's on a city by city basis. And at El Cerrito, and actually we are currently reviewing an agreement with BART where we'll have designated parking at every BART station where they own property, including El Cerrito. So we do have some bikes deployed there, but because we don't have necessarily a formal agreement, we can't put 50 bikes there.
I see, okay.
So we've been operating in good faith at a reduced rate per BART's request. But that is coming hopefully in a month or so after we go back and forth, our legal teams go back and forth a little bit.
Maybe taking that information and titrating it an approach would be to set spots along the Albany Greenway, since that's not,
Yeah.
people don't consider that their neighborhood. And if you're going for kind of that, 1 mile trip, then people can pick them up from there and go to the 72R, for instance, or go to BART. Whereas I think these locations are, I don't know, I mean, it's just my impression, they don't strike me as the ideal place for people to pick something up if they're commuting to a transit.
Yeah, I think
station,
that's a
so,
good idea.
yeah.
Don't you guys, just following up on that, don't you guys optimize your locations as you get more data and figure out what the trips are?
Yes, we're always optimizing. I have like weekly data reports basically on what hotspots are working or what are not, and altering on a weekly basis.
Other questions?
Two questions on related to data. One specifically, do you guys provide accident or injury data related to your passengers?
We do not. We do have an MDS data sharing ability, but
What's that? And
it's just basically a dashboard, a way of viewing data that makes it more accessible for cities. And we work with Remix, which is an organization that helps navigate data on a partnership with them.
Okay.
But currently, no, I don't even have access to our safety data. We are hiring a head of trust and safety, so I think that'll be changing in the next few months.
Okay. So cities and other cities that are entering into agreements with you won't have access to safety data?
No,
accident or
like,
incident data?
for instance, we're going through a permitting process in Oakland right now, and it's not in the terms or conditions or agreement. The city themselves are tracking the data, because also we don't really have, if an accident occurs, I don't really have access to that information myself, especially, sometimes we're not notified of it.
Sure. Okay. But there are incidents that you guys are notified of that you guys are collecting data on, but not sharing that with the cities or the public?
I can't speak for our company as a whole, but as the general manager for the Bay Area, I'm not tracking accidents. I've only been notified of one because one of my operations specialists witnessed a hit and run where someone was struck while they were in a bike lane, riding a scooter in Oakland, and we reached out to the user and reported it to the city. But other than that, I have not been notified of other specific accidents.
Claims?
We do have a claims department that deals with insurance, but again, I can't really directly speak to that.
Okay. And then the more general question on data, what data would be available to the cities that you're entering into agreements in? Is there origin destination data? That's probably the most, without getting into
Trip
personal.
start, trip in, longitude, latitude, amount of trips, unique users, as well as like heat maps and like fleet count, vehicle availability, length of trip, CO2 saved, and also I'm sure there's like a lot of some things that I'm forgetting. Yeah, but trip start and trip end is data that's also provided to the city. As well as like maintenance logs or customer service complaints and response times, depending on the city.
Okay, thanks.
I've never used your scooter, and I've seen them, but I haven't looked at close up, so I just have some quick questions about the scooter itself.
Yeah.
So the minimum age of your riders would be 16? Is that?
18, state law
so they
is
have to,
18.
Okay. And they have to have a driver's license to operate the scooter. Is that stated anywhere on the scooter you need a driver's license to operate the scooter?
So it's not stated on the scooter because in other states or cities, and we use the same fleet and they're branded the same, they don't have those legal requirements, but in the app before you're able to rent a scooter, you have to scan and verify your driver's license. Here in Oakland, originally we were hesitant to do it because of an equity issue, but like when we launched in San Jose a year ago, but a few months after that, we decided to implement a driver's license scan.
And then does your scooter have lights on it?
It has lights on the front and the rear, and they're on all the time when the scooter is operating.
could you drive the scooter at night, or is it not?
Yeah.
You could, okay.
It's like probably as powerful as my like nice bike light that I have for my own bike.
Can I follow up on your question? How do you, somehow people are getting around the way to ride a scooter, because I think, so I work in downtown Oakland. I think the most popular use is the high school that's right behind me. And so how is that happening? Because, I mean, there are lots of young kids definitely riding the scooters.
So I can't speak to all of the instances. Some instances, people's parents do provide them with access to their account. And I'm sure that like there could be, you know, it's a product. So I don't really have the answer to that completely. But we did have a huge fraud issue in Oakland. So that's something that we've cut down on, and we hadn't really seen anywhere else.
So further to the map of where you might deploy, I didn't see any in UC Village. Have you spoken to UC about any deployment there?
We have not reached out yet because this is just the initial conversation, but it's in the plan to do so.
Okay. I agree with Preston about the Albany Greenway being a good area to deploy. The other bike path that I'm not really seeing is the Buchanan bike path, maybe near the USDA facility or Ocean View Park. There may be some users there.
Cool. I'll definitely reshift some of this before we do deploy scooters.
So you're just looking for input on this one?
Yes.
And do the commissioners have any additional input?
So I think we need to, so lots of cities are really taking some serious consideration here to the point where they're definitely contemplating whether or not to even have the scooters in their cities. And Oakland, our neighbors in Oakland and Berkeley, they've gone through a very rigorous process to give permission to scooters in their cities. I get it that we're a smaller city, and maybe our traffic conditions are different. But I think we do have to just monitor this closely, especially when there isn't accident data out there yet or injury data out there yet. I think it's going to be coming at some point, and we'll see what that looks like. We entered into a 6-month pilot with the bikes. I would propose that we do something similar with the scooters and evaluate before the 6-month period expires and see how we want to continue. The other piece here is also in downtown Oakland, 0 people wear helmets, right? So no one wears a helmet on these things. And they're different from the bikes. They have a faster acceleration, probably go a little bit faster. They're slightly, they're smaller. So what I've seen at least, and it's all anecdotal, but you know, people are definitely more daring on the scooters than they are on the bikes. If there's a way for kids to access these, which apparently there is, then that's something that we have to be really mindful of. And so I don't know what the safety campaign would be behind this, and is Lime going to be giving helmets out in Albany or doing some sort of safety campaign? But I think those are the 2 pieces that I'd want to try to have staff or the city go forward with, which is some sort of 6-month pilot to see where everything stands at that point, and then whatever safety campaign would be tied with that. It sounds like the data, you know, if we're getting origin destination data and lots of trip use data, then as long as that's all available to us too, I think that's so useful.
And I would add that I think the advantage of a smaller city sometimes is that we do have a closer working relationship with the police department. So if there was a serious accident, we would know about it and we could report that as, you know, the details as appropriate.
But even as, you know, data comes out nationwide, not necessarily in Albany, and, you know, you start seeing some significant injuries or lots of injuries or whatever it may be, those that we'll want to take that into consideration as well in our city.
Yeah, I'm a little trepidatious about the injury rates in the early days because it is new technology, and so I think there's a learning curve and a winnowing curve and whatnot. So, I mean, I know there's obviously a lot of discussion about that now, but again, it's so new to the area. I don't think we've fully seen the benefit yet. So we're seeing, higher risk and lower benefit right now, and that over time those could cross much more. So, I think a pilot's reasonable, but I'm not necessarily 6 months going to say, okay, we've had 3 bad accidents, so no more. I don't know. We'll just see when we get there.
Yeah.
I think it's a good checkpoint.
Most of my concern beyond that is what's already been mentioned is with sidewalks. And I understand you do work to inform. In Albany, our major walking shopping district is Solano Avenue, and the temptation is to ride scooters there now. And the shop doors open right up onto the sidewalk. So something I want to be very mindful of. Other comments? Can we move on? Thank you so much for
Thank
coming and
you.
presenting and for waiting patiently.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Great. And we hope to see you back. So, please.
I was going to suggest we talk about the remaining agenda items and see whether there are some things you might want to have pushed forward. In particular, the crosswalk discussion is not time sensitive. It's just something that we've had floating around for a while, and we could bring that back to you next month. And the Gilman Interchange, I have the capability of giving you a summary of a presentation that was made last week in Berkeley that could go on as long as you wanted it to, which may not.
Knowing this group.
But I'm not recommending that the commission need to take any action unless there's something that you folks see. So, again, it's up to you. The information, we have attached is the environmental document, and there's a very detailed webpage on the ACTC webpage on the project. So you can tell me how you would like, what you would like, if anything, on that this evening.
Well, the crosswalk striping, I think we should delay. That's an easy one. I think Albany's had a great deal of comment and contribution to the Gilman I-80 interchange.
Weekly.
And so I think we could put that one off as well. Does anybody object to that?
I would like to make a comment on the crosswalk striping, just. I just wanted to read something from a AC.
I think I'm going to ask you to save that.
Okay.
Unless it's time sensitive.
Well, I just might inform when it comes back. There might be some adjustments to staff report and whatnot.
We'd be happy to just touch base with you offline maybe and make it.
I'm sorry, it just doesn't fit into the format of the meeting.
Okay.
But if it should inform, then yes, please inform. And you and I can have an offline conversation about prioritizing that as agenda item. Or I should say you should have a conversation with the chair going forward about prioritization on the agenda.
Sure.
Okay. So I think we should proceed directly to the item number 5.6, which staff has prepared a couple of, and Harry left, unfortunately. Staff's prepared a couple of resolutions.
Yes, we'd appreciate your feedback on that. If it's acceptable, we can print them out and have you sign them, and we would forward them on to our recently departed commissioners who were terrific contributors to the commission over the last few years.
I found these pretty robust, and I absolutely appreciate the contributions of the past commissioners.
Not seeing any comments, I'll move that we adopt the resolutions of appreciation for Commissioners Susan Reeves and Harry Chomsky.
I'll second.
Any discussion?
I just want to note that these aren't exactly the same, and I appreciate that there's some recognition of each of their unique contributions. Thank you.
Seeing no more discussion, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, abstain? Hearing none, unanimously pass. And that takes us to item number 5.7, the selection of chair and vice chair. And just as background, we try to mix up the leadership of the commission on a regular basis and take turns. I'm just coming off of a year of being chair. And who was the vice chair?
I was vice, yeah, and then I was chair 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
2 years ago, yeah, yeah. And it had been 4 years since I had been chair before, so that
Right, so we're kind
mix
of
it up.
rotating through.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've looked at that copy of the handbook which you have with you, but the recommendations are that the chair turn over, if not every year, at least every couple of years.
Okay. I nominate, can I nominate?
Yeah.
Are we at that point? I nominate Commissioner Del Rosario to be the chair.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Sounds good.
I nominate Commissioner Paulson to be vice chair.
I'll second that too.
Oh, okay.
Do you accept?
So that would entail.
Whoa!
To be clear, that the vice chair is the alternate meeting leader, and it's it's a good carrot for keeping your attention focused during meetings. And there are times when individuals have to recuse themselves, so you might be leading part of a meeting. Are you comfortable with that?
Sure, yes.
Does, I don't know what the current practice is, but it seems, I think on some bodies, the vice chair sometimes participates in the agenda setting, and some they don't.
haven't done that
Okay, I'm just checking.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure you get the full picture here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll note that means that next year we'll be probably looking to you to take over as chair, unless
Good point.
Robert wants to continue. And, to be clear, I think there's no worry about Preston and I staying engaged, so you don't need us in a leadership.
I'm not worried about that. So, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Congratulations. We have a new chair and vice chair.
Me take over?
Yeah.
All right, item 6, announcements. 6.1, you have other announcements other than 6.1. Save the date, advisory body and Brown Act training on February 25th, 6:30 to 8 p.m.
So I'll say again, I said it earlier, but February 14th, the Active Transportation Working Group of the MTC will be considering Street Saver. Corresponding with the Active Transportation lead staff member there, they asked that BPACs that are interested can send a member and that those members try to aggregate questions. So if you have any questions that you want me to ask, I guess send them along and I'll ask them.
So you're proposing yourself as a representative
I'm going.
of this body as a BPAC?
I'm going. So happy to have company, but I'm definitely going one way or another.
Okay.
Any other announcements?
One other announcement, we received notice and are distributing from AC Transit that there is a proposal to change the fare, and there are some upcoming community meetings, the nearest one for us in El Cerrito City Hall next Tuesday, January 29th, from 6 to 8 p.m.
And just to add to that, the public hearing will be on February 13th. Question on 6.1, unless anyone else has any other questions. Is that mandatory for new commissioners, existing?
It's strongly encouraged for everyone. We have a contract city attorney, not Craig Labadie, but Kat Wellman, who has been a backup sometimes for Craig, will be there to give the training and answer your questions. And then the city clerk and I are going to go through the handbook to refresh everybody's memory and some League of City reference guides to help give you the tools to answer some of the questions that we frequently hear from commissioners and committee members. And we'll try to keep it interesting and informative and quick, and there'll be snacks, and so it's at least
there's food.
Painful as we can possibly make it.
Legal bribe.
Please, and I do think there are some important things that, even you're all very experienced commissioners and you know the drill, but the laws in California are very complicated, particularly with respect to electronic communications now, and they're changing, that kind of stuff. It wouldn't hurt for you to participate and have your questions answered.
Any other announcements or discussion on item 6? Okay, item 7, future agenda items. Anyone have anything?
Work plan?
We can tell you what we have kind of in the queue for the next meeting. Do you want to?
That's not what you meant, is it?
Well, it might be part of what they have in the queue for the next meeting.
Sure, so pavement program part 2, Solano Complete Streets, work plan, soda tax, the 900 block speed hump location approval, and permanent encroachments, the specifics of 958 Nielsen.
So that is a list of projects. It's a pretty long meeting. Solano Avenue Complete Streets obviously is a big thing. The soda tax item, this is the commission is annually asked to provide the city council comments on how you feel soda tax revenues should be expended, and that's time sensitive. So some of these other things, we're ready to take them on, but we can also push them off without an impact. So as an example, the Peralta speed hump, we're sensitive to their need, their desire to have this addressed, but it won't affect the timing of the execution if we were to push it off till March. Justin will be away for the next meeting, so I'll be on my own probably with Robert's help on some of these things, but I could use the extra. It's not a light agenda by any means, but I don't want to overload the agenda because it will just, the quality of what you get is, there's only so much time, so I want to give you good staff support. We can consult with the new chair and new vice chair if she would like. A week or two before the meeting, we'd like to do that and just kind of run through it and get a feel for what you feel is a good meeting.
I'm curious if there's any time nexus between the crosswalk discussion and the pavement project that is just gone out to bid or is going to go out to bid in terms of, I don't know what crosswalks are included in that. I don't know what format those crosswalks are, and I don't know if that can be changed readily if we adopt some different standard.
For higher visibility crosswalks, I believe Continental is what's in the package. So this is the proposal that we had on the agenda was to talk about institutionalizing what we've already shifted to.
And if we decided something different?
Then it would be affecting future projects. I think that one would be either a change order or it would be designed as it's designed.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else for agenda planning?
I guess I would like the crosswalks to go up next time to the extent that.
So for February, you definitely like crosswalks?
I mean, that's my vote, one of 5. And then whatever can be pushed off to make room for that.
We should try to hold to the 3-hour time limit, right? If we, yes, we can.
Good luck with it.
We can manage the. We can manage. Maybe you didn't know that, huh? We extend a lot of time here. But we can go over an agenda for.
Did we want to agendize a white zone on Masonic south of Garfield?
Yes.
Presumably, we don't have to do that next month to
Right,
have it
right,
take effect in time with the school year.
right. So there was also in public comment, I think this is all the northern traffic calming plans and projects that we've already discussed, but there was Cornell Avenue and the concern about it, how to advance the plans for that street and traffic calming. So I don't know if something needs to come back to the commission or if there's just some kind of notification out as to the status of projects.
Well, after her public comment, I made sure that she had my contact information. We'll touch base, and we'll let you know if there's something that's ready for commission discussion. Sooner or later, we probably should bring back to you an update on that project. And there's more than one person to reach out to in that neighborhood that, different areas have different perspectives on it.
Sure. Okay. Anything else for future agenda items? Okay. Item 8, next meeting is Thursday, February 28th at 7 p.m. Same location, same time. All right, and item 9, we are adjourned.
Woohoo!
Thank you. And welcome, our new members.